The luxurious restaurant was buzzing with life, the clink of fine china and the soft murmur of hushed conversations creating an elegant symphony. Tim, a young waiter with a stiff white shirt and a tired look in his eyes, navigated through the crowd, balancing plates of gourmet food on his arm. His heart pounded in his chest, not because he was serving expensive dishes to the city's elite, but because he was on the verge of losing his job. Tonight was a crucial night, the kind where everything had to go perfectly. He could feel the weight of the expectations pressing on him with every step he took. The manager had already warned him that any slip-up, any wrong order, could be his last. The job wasn't just a paycheck, it was his lifeline. But Tim's mind wasn't on his performance. It was on the pile of bills waiting for him at home, and the constant pressure from his mother to find a more stable career. In this moment, he hated the life of a waiter. "Tim, focus," his colleague Lily hissed, her sharp tone cutting through his distracted thoughts. She was a seasoned veteran of the restaurant, and her eyes were always scanning the room, anticipating what was coming next. Tim could see the anxiety in her eyes, too. This restaurant catered to the wealthiest of the wealthy, and every customer was a potential disaster waiting to happen. As if on cue, the door swung open with a soft chime, and in walked a man, tall, with thick, dark hair, a scruffy beard, and a quiet presence that seemed to immediately command attention. Tim didn't look twice at him. Just another rich guy, he thought, probably here to flaunt his wealth. But Lily's sudden intake of breath caught his attention. "Keanu Reeves," she whispered, almost under her breath, as if the name was sacred. Tim blinked, confused. "What?" he asked, his tone dismissive. He didn't have time to care about movie stars. This was real life, and he was working his ass off to keep afloat. "That's Keanu Reeves," Lily repeated, her voice almost in awe. "The Keanu Reeves. The actor." Tim's eyes flickered toward the man now seated at one of the prime tables by the window. The dim lighting only seemed to make his presence more enigmatic. Tim didn't recognize him. Sure, the name rang a bell, but Tim didn't follow movies, and he certainly didn't care about celebrity status. As the manager approached Keanu's table, Tim rolled his eyes. "Another one of these," he muttered to himself. Celebrities, rich enough to buy anything they wanted, and yet they still seemed so out of touch with real life. He focused back on his table. Another perfectly plated dish to deliver. But Lily wasn't done with her reverence. "Tim, you have no idea. That man, he's a legend. A total class act. He owns this place, for God's sake. Not just a guest. The actual owner." Tim's face scrunched in disbelief. The owner? Seriously? He couldn't believe it. How could a guy like that, a movie star, own this place? The thought of it made Tim's blood boil a little. The whole thing seemed like some overblown Hollywood fantasy. But his curiosity was piqued, and he glanced over at the man once more. Keanu was now deep in conversation with the manager, and the sight of him seemed to make the whole room a little bit quieter. There was something effortlessly magnetic about him, something Tim couldn't quite put his finger on. "Hey, Tim, could you get his drink order?" "I can't," Lily said, nudging him. "I'm way too nervous to go over there." Tim sighed and adjusted his tie. His nerves kicked in again. He couldn't back out now. He'd been in plenty of uncomfortable situations before. This one, though, this one felt different. Maybe it was because the person sitting there was someone who didn't care about fancy titles or wealth. He had seen enough of that. He had seen the way the other customers looked at him, dismissing him as just another waiter. Maybe this time, he could be the one to stand his ground. Maybe this time, he could say what everyone else was thinking. He walked toward Keanu's table, trying to shake off the growing feeling of unease in his stomach. As he approached, Keanu glanced up at him with an almost imperceptible smile, those deep brown eyes holding an air of quiet intelligence. Tim hesitated for a moment, but quickly forged ahead. "What can I get you to drink, sir?" Tim asked, his voice a little too sharp. Keanu's smile widened slightly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "A glass of red wine, please," he replied calmly. Tim nodded and turned to leave, but then, feeling a strange rush of indignation, he couldn't resist. He had dealt with enough rich people to know the drill. He leaned in a little closer, speaking in a low voice so only Keanu could hear. You know, it's kind of funny, Tim said, his words dripping with a subtle bitterness. You guys sit here like you're royalty, thinking the world owes you everything, while people like me are busting our butts to make ends meet. Maybe you should try living a day in my shoes. There was a long pause. Keanu didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, the quiet intensity of his gaze locking with Tim's for a brief moment that felt like an eternity. Tim felt his heart race, realizing the words had left his mouth before he could stop them. Keanu finally spoke, his voice still calm and even, without any sign of offense. I see, he said softly, still maintaining eye contact. Thank you for your honesty. Tim stood frozen for a second, taken aback by how unfazed Keanu seemed. He turned to walk away, still reeling from what he had just said. But little did he know, he had just made a huge mistake. Tim's shift dragged on, the hours blending into one long blur. The restaurant was filled with the usual crowd, powerful executives, influential figures, and those who lived with an air of wealth and entitlement. Tim, on the other hand, was doing his best to make it through the night without messing anything up. His mind was still replaying the conversation with Keanu, the unexpected tension of his own words hanging in the air like a bad smell. He couldn't believe he had said what he did. Who did he think he was, talking to someone like that? Sure, Keanu may have been just another rich guy to Tim, but the reality of the situation was far different than Tim's initial frustration. The truth was, Tim had been struggling for a while. His life was a constant balancing act of bills, unpaid rent, and his mother's incessant phone calls about finding a real job. Tim was 24, yet it felt like life was already slipping away from him. His mother, ever the realist, had never believed in his dreams of something bigger. You need to find something stable, she always said. Stop playing games and get a real career. Tim's father, absent for most of his life, had been a distant memory, leaving Tim to navigate the world without much guidance. But there was something inside him, some deep-rooted desire, that couldn't accept mediocrity. He didn't want to be stuck in a cycle of waiting tables, living paycheck to paycheck. He dreamed of something more, something beyond the glare of city lights and the polished surfaces of restaurants. He had never really believed in the dream of fame, wealth, or celebrity, but he sure as hell wanted the freedom that came with being in control of his own life. As Tim made his rounds through the restaurant, he tried to push the encounter with Keanu to the back of his mind. There was no point in stressing over something he couldn't change. He had done his job, and that was that. But his thoughts kept drifting back to it. It had been a casual remark, a passing thought. Tim's frustration had simply spilled out at the wrong moment. He hadn't meant to make a scene, but as always, the words had a way of escaping before he could catch them. The worst part? Keanu hadn't reacted the way Tim expected. In fact, Tim had been prepared for a scene, for Keanu to challenge him, to show him the vast chasm between the world Tim lived in and the one Keanu inhabited. But no, Keanu had taken it all in stride, offering no defensive reply. Instead, he had just nodded with a quiet understanding that unsettled Tim even more. By the time Tim's shift came to an end, his hands were trembling from exhaustion, and his mind felt foggy. He had never been so relieved to leave the restaurant. The night had been a blur of awkwardness and exhaustion, and yet, the encounter with Keanu lingered like a shadow. "You okay, Tim?" Lily asked, as Tim made his way toward the employee locker room. He shrugged, trying to shake off the weight of the night. "Yeah, just tired. Long night, you know?" She gave him a skeptical look, but didn't press the matter further. Instead, she smiled wryly. "I saw you talking to Keanu Reeves. Pretty cool, huh?" Tim's stomach flipped at the mention of Keanu's name, and he felt the heat rise to his cheeks. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered, not wanting to explain how awkward things had gotten. Lily was still grinning. "I've seen a lot of famous faces, but Keanu's something else. He's so grounded, you know? Not like most of these celebrities who walk around like they own the place. He doesn't act like he's above anyone." Tim didn't respond, still feeling the sting of his words hanging in the air. What if Keanu thought he was just another entitled waiter too? What if that was the end of it? Would he get fired? Would the manager say something to him? He quickly shoved his jacket on and grabbed his bag, needing to get away. "I'm gonna head out," he said, trying to sound casual. Lily gave him a puzzled look. "You sure? You seem a little off tonight." "I'm fine. Just need to sleep," Tim said with a half smile, hoping she wouldn't push it further. As he stepped out into the chilly night air, Tim's mind raced. His heart was still pounding from the exchange with Keanu. He wished he could take back what he said, rewind time, and have a do-over. But it wasn't like he could go back and apologize. Keanu would probably never remember the brief encounter. He was a movie star, after all. Tim was just another waiter. Still, there was a part of him that felt like this was the universe's way of testing him. Like everything had been building up to this one moment, this brief and strange interaction that felt like a turning point. Tim couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The next day, Tim woke up late. The stress of the night before had left him with little sleep. He had a shift to get ready for, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way Keanu had looked at him. That quiet gaze had somehow pierced through the walls Tim had built around himself. As he prepared to go to work, Tim couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of dread. What would happen when he went back to the restaurant? Would Keanu be there again? Would he be angry? Or worse, would he be indifferent? Tim had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure. His life was never going to be the same again. Later that afternoon, Tim arrived at the restaurant, walking with hesitant steps through the familiar entrance. The moment he stepped inside, the manager, Mr. Garrison, caught sight of him and motioned for him to come over. "Tim, a word," Mr. Garrison said with a stern look on his face. Tim's stomach dropped. Was this it? Was he finally getting fired? He walked toward the manager, trying to steady his nerves. "What's up?" Tim asked, forcing the words out, his throat dry. Mr. Garrison's expression softened slightly. "I just wanted to let you know that we're bringing in some special guests tonight. One of them is quite important. You'll be serving the table. I trust you're up for it?" Tim felt a pang of confusion. "Special guests? Who?" he asked. "The man who was here last night," Mr. Garrison said, his tone dropping to a whisper. "Keanu Reeves. He owns the place." Tim froze, his heart pounding once again. He hadn't realized it then, but now it felt like the universe was handing him a second chance. Tim stood there, frozen in shock. His mind raced, trying to piece everything together. Keanu Reeves. The actor, the one he'd made that offhand comment to. The one who was, as it turned out, the owner of the restaurant. The same man he had insulted without even knowing who he was. For a moment, it felt like the room around him was closing in. He could hear the faint hum of conversation from the other patrons, the soft clink of glassware, but it all felt distant. His breath was shallow, and his palms began to sweat. He had no idea how he was going to face Keanu again, or if he even could face him. "Tim," Mr. Garrison's voice broke through his panic. "I trust you can handle this. You've got a lot of potential here, but if you screw up again, we'll have to reconsider things." Tim nodded quickly, his throat tight. "Of course. I'll handle it." The manager's eyes narrowed as he studied Tim, seemingly sensing his unease. "Good. I'm putting you in charge of his table tonight. Make sure everything goes smoothly. I don't want any slip-ups." Tim barely heard the rest of Mr. Garrison's words. His mind was still reeling. Keanu owned the place. The man he'd just insulted, who had sat there, listening to Tim's frustration with an almost unnerving calm, was the person who could make or break his career at this restaurant. As the night went on, Tim's anxiety grew. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the previous evening. His mind replayed the encounter over and over, each time making him cringe even more. He'd spoken out of turn, and the realization that he might have ruined his chance to even remain employed was nearly unbearable. The hours seemed to stretch on endlessly, and Tim found himself staring at the door every time it opened, half expecting Keanu to walk through. It wasn't long before the inevitable happened. As the clock ticked toward the evening's peak, the front door opened, and there he was again. Keanu Reeves, stepping through with the same calm presence that seemed to command attention without demanding it. The moment he entered, the atmosphere in the room subtly shifted. The other patrons didn't notice, but the staff did. A few people straightened up a little, adjusting their uniforms, clearing their throats, as though the air itself became charged. Keanu was followed by two other individuals, likely close friends or colleagues, both well-dressed but not nearly as conspicuous. They walked with an easy familiarity, not treating the space as though it were something to be admired from afar, but as if it was simply another comfortable place to spend an evening. Tim swallowed hard, forcing himself to take slow, steady breaths. He stood by the bar, waiting for the moment to approach, his mind spinning. What was he going to say to Keanu? How could he possibly fix this? Should he apologize again, even though the man had already been so gracious the night before? Or would that just make things worse? Tim. Lily's voice cut through his anxious thoughts. She had approached him quietly, her eyes flickering with concern. Are you okay? You've been staring at the door for the last 10 minutes. You're not thinking of hiding, are you? Tim gave her a tight smile. I can't hide from this, Lily. He's the owner. I've already messed up. Lily frowned but didn't argue. You're going to be fine. Just do what you do best. And remember, he's not some untouchable celebrity. He's just a guy. You know? You can't let your nerves take over. Before Tim could respond, Mr. Garrison appeared beside them, his gaze scanning the room. Tim, get to work. Keanu's already sitting. It's your table tonight. Don't screw this up. Tim nodded, feeling his stomach lurch. His footsteps felt heavier than usual as he walked toward Keanu's table. His mind raced for something, anything, to say. He knew he couldn't just walk up and act like nothing had happened. But what should he say? His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. As he approached the table, Keanu looked up at him, that same quiet smile playing at the corner of his lips. Tim felt his throat dry up, the words getting stuck somewhere between his chest and his mouth. The two other people at the table glanced up as well, giving Tim the polite attention of those accustomed to fine dining. But Keanu's eyes were the only ones that truly held Tim's attention. Good evening, Tim managed, his voice shaky despite his best efforts. Can I get you anything to start? Keanu's smile widened slightly. I'm happy with water for now, thank you. Tim nodded quickly, too eager to leave the table to notice Keanu's calm demeanor. As he turned to leave, however, he couldn't stop himself from blurting out the words that had been eating at him all day. I want to apologize, he said, his voice barely audible. About last night. I didn't know who you were. And what I said? Keanu raised a hand, silencing him with a gesture that was both understanding and unassuming. There's no need to apologize, Tim, he said, his voice warm and steady. We all say things in the heat of the moment. I understand. Tim blinked, completely thrown off by Keanu's response. The words he had expected, a reprimand, or worse, an uncomfortable silence, didn't come. Instead, Keanu's response was filled with a kind of easy grace that left Tim speechless. You're doing your job, Keanu continued, his gaze never leaving Tim's. I don't take offense to that. You were honest, and that's something I appreciate. I think you'll do well here. The weight of his words hung in the air as Tim tried to process them. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at Keanu in disbelief. He had expected judgment, or perhaps a cold silence, but instead, Keanu's response was like a weight lifted off his chest. It was as though the man saw through all the pretense, through all of Tim's uncertainty, and simply understood. Tim found himself unable to say anything more. Instead, he nodded silently and walked away, feeling as though his world had shifted just a little bit. Keanu Reeves, the owner, the star, wasn't some untouchable figure. He was just a person who had been patient and kind, despite Tim's own rash words. But little did Tim know, this was just the beginning of the transformation that would unfold over the coming days. The rest of Tim's shift passed in a blur. He moved through the evening in a haze, his mind still processing Keanu's unexpected kindness. Every time he passed by Keanu's table, he couldn't help but glance over, trying to catch a glimpse of the man who had shown him more understanding than anyone else had in a long time. Keanu was quiet, engaged in his conversation with the two others, but there was something magnetic about his presence. It was as though his very demeanor demanded respect without ever needing to ask for it. And Tim felt the weight of the lesson that had been imparted to him. In that brief exchange, he realized just how much he had let his bitterness and assumptions control his interactions with others. He had judged Keanu without knowing anything about him, and yet, the actor had treated him with a level of patience and dignity that Tim could only dream of offering in return. As the evening wound down, Tim's responsibilities increased. He had been running back and forth between tables, ensuring everyone was satisfied, but his mind kept drifting back to Keanu's table. It was hard to focus, to keep his composure. There was still that undercurrent of tension in the air, the kind that came from knowing you'd messed up, but that tension was being replaced by something else, an uncomfortable curiosity. Could Tim learn something from this man? Could Keanu teach him how to be more? As he brought the final round of drinks to a table near the back, he saw Keanu getting up from his own table, his companions standing as well. They were getting ready to leave. Tim's heart raced, and he found himself taking an unnecessary detour, hoping to cross paths again. As he walked past the bar, he saw Keanu standing by the exit, chatting casually with the manager, Mr. Garrison. Tim's footsteps faltered as he got closer. His stomach twisted. Should he approach him again? Should he say something else? He had already apologized, but something about this felt unfinished. Keanu's voice broke through his hesitation. Tim, right? Tim froze, his eyes wide as he looked up. Keanu's gaze was calm, but there was something almost knowing in it, as though he had been waiting for this moment. Yeah, that's me, Tim replied, his voice still a little unsteady. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he certainly wasn't prepared for the smile Keanu gave him. I just wanted to say, you've got a good heart, Keanu said simply. It's easy to get lost in the pressure of things, but I can tell you care about what you do. And that's important. Tim was taken aback. He had never imagined that anyone, let alone someone as successful as Keanu, would take the time to give him this kind of feedback. He hadn't earned the praise, not in his eyes, and yet here Keanu was, offering it without hesitation. Thank you, Tim said quietly, feeling a little lost for words. Keanu nodded, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. Just keep going, Tim. You never know where life might take you. But it's the little things that make all the difference. Don't lose your way. Tim watched as Keanu and his companions made their way toward the exit, disappearing into the cool night air. For a long moment, Tim stood there, still processing what had just happened. There was a sense of finality in the way Keanu had spoken, as though the actor, who owned the place and had every reason to be indifferent to Tim's plight, had genuinely taken a moment to connect. The restaurant slowly emptied out as the night wore on, and Tim's shift finally came to an end. But it wasn't like any other closing shift he'd had before. The usual fatigue didn't weigh on him as heavily. Instead, he felt lighter, as though something inside him had shifted, just a little. The next day, Tim arrived at work early. It was a quiet morning shift, the calm before the rush. The restaurant was practically empty except for a few early morning patrons. Mr. Garrison was busy making the rounds, checking on everything, while Tim made his way to the back to prepare for the night. He found himself thinking again about Keanu's words. Don't lose your way. The idea of not losing your way stuck with him. What did it mean to Tim? Was it a message to keep his head above water, no matter how rough the seas became? Or was it more than that? Maybe it was a call to reassess what he truly wanted in life. Tim had spent so many years feeling stuck, focused only on survival, but something Keanu had said made him pause. It's the little things that make all the difference. For the first time in a long while, Tim considered the possibility that maybe there was more to life than getting by. Maybe it wasn't about fighting for just the next paycheck or keeping his head above water. It was about truly finding meaning, even in the everyday moments. The rest of the afternoon passed quickly, and as evening rolled in, Tim's mind was still occupied with his thoughts. The door chime rang as customers began filing in, and Tim moved quickly to start taking orders and serving the first round of drinks. But his approach was different now. He found himself smiling more, engaging more with the customers, and focusing on making sure every detail was just right. There was a new sense of purpose in his movements, something he hadn't felt before. By the time the night shift arrived, the restaurant was filled with familiar faces, but Tim felt different. It wasn't that he was perfect now, or that everything was suddenly easier. but he felt more present, more attuned to the world around him. Maybe it was the fact that Keanu had given him something intangible, something deeper than just a job. It was an invitation to be better, to be more intentional in how he approached life. As the night progressed, Tim couldn't help but feel a growing sense of hope. There was no grand plan, no sudden revelation about how everything would magically fall into place, but there was a new sense of clarity in his heart. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely lost. When the evening came to a close and he was cleaning up the bar, Mr. Garrison approached him with an unexpected offer. "You've been doing good work lately, Tim," the manager said with a rare compliment. "I've been noticing. Keep it up, and there might be a promotion for you in the near future." Tim couldn't help but smile, but this time, it was a different kind of smile. It was one of gratitude, not for the promotion, but for the realization that sometimes, all it takes is a single moment, a single interaction, to change the way you see everything. And with that, Tim felt ready for whatever came next. The next few weeks were a whirlwind for Tim. The restaurant, as always, was a flurry of activity during the dinner rush, but now Tim felt like he was approaching each shift with a renewed sense of purpose. The fear and anxiety that had once gripped him every time he walked into the restaurant had slowly begun to dissipate. He had started to view each shift not just as a means to survive, but as an opportunity to grow, to prove to himself that he could be more than just a waiter. Keanu's words still echoed in his mind, especially the part about not losing your way. Tim wasn't entirely sure what his way was yet, but he was determined to figure it out. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path, even if it was just a small step forward. As he continued to work, Tim noticed subtle shifts in the way his colleagues interacted with him. Lily, who had always been friendly, seemed to notice the change in his attitude. She'd stopped teasing him about being a stressed-out mess, and instead started asking for his opinion on how to handle difficult customers. Mr. Garrison had become a little more approving, giving Tim more responsibility and occasionally even complimenting him on his work. And the customers? They seemed to be responding to his newfound energy, with more tips and even occasional words of praise. But no matter how much things changed around him, Tim couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Keanu had set something in motion. Keanu had unknowingly opened Tim's eyes to something deeper than just his job. It was about his life, his attitude toward the world, and his belief that he could do more, be more. One evening, as the dinner rush wound down and the restaurant started to quiet, Tim found himself glancing over at the bar. He had just finished serving a few final rounds of drinks, and there, at the bar, was Keanu. He wasn't there for a formal dinner. Instead, he was sitting casually, sipping on a glass of red wine, talking quietly to a couple of other patrons. Tim had to admit that he was surprised. He hadn't seen Keanu at the restaurant much lately. He'd always been somewhat of an elusive presence, but now it seemed like he was more relaxed, as though he was blending in just like any other guest. Tim hesitated for a moment. Should he go over? Should he even approach him? He had already apologized, and the encounter had already been more than he'd expected, but something inside Tim stirred. He wanted to thank Keanu again, or at least show him how much his words had truly meant. Gathering his courage, Tim walked over to the bar, trying his best to appear casual. As he neared, Keanu's eyes lifted, and he gave him that same warm, quiet smile. "Hey, Tim," Keanu said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Hey, Keanu," Tim replied, feeling slightly awkward but also comforted by the familiarity in Keanu's tone. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." Keanu shrugged lightly. "I like to check in every once in a while. Make sure everything's running smoothly. You know how it is." Tim nodded, unsure of what to say next. He wasn't sure if Keanu wanted to talk, but before he could retreat into silence, Keanu surprised him again. "You're doing well," Keanu said, his eyes still soft, but with a hint of approval. "I can see it. You're more at ease these days." Tim's heart skipped a beat. More at ease, Keanu had noticed. It was strange how a few words could carry so much weight. "Thanks," Tim said, smiling with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I guess I've just been trying to keep my head in the game. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, actually." Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, yeah, about not losing my way," Tim continued, feeling a bit more open now. It's been eye-opening, honestly. I've been trying to make better choices, not just in the job, but in life, too. I think I've been focusing too much on surviving rather than living. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. It's easy to get caught up in the grind, especially when you're trying to make a living. But sometimes, the best way to live is to find purpose in what you're already doing. The little things matter. Tim felt a surge of appreciation. The little things matter. It sounded so simple, but Keanu's reminder had helped Tim understand the value in his own day-to-day interactions. It wasn't just about climbing a career ladder or chasing some elusive, bigger life. It was about finding fulfillment and growth in the moments that were right in front of him. Do you think it's too late to change? Tim asked, almost impulsively. Keanu paused, his smile fading into something more contemplative. It's never too late. Change happens every day, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. You can always choose to take a different path, even if it's just one step at a time. Tim let out a breath, feeling both relieved and inspired. Keanu wasn't just talking about work or success, he was talking about life in its entirety. And for once, Tim felt like he didn't have to have everything figured out. He could take his time, focus on doing the best he could each day, and allow change to happen naturally. As the evening wore on, Keanu finished his drink and stood up to leave. He turned to Tim with a thoughtful expression. "You've got something good going here, Tim. Don't let that go," he said before reaching for his coat. "Thanks, Keanu," Tim said, his voice sincere. "You've already helped more than you know." Keanu gave him a small, knowing smile. "I'm just reminding you of what you already knew. Take care, Tim. I'll be around." And with that, Keanu left the restaurant, slipping into the night as quietly as he had entered. Tim stood there for a moment, letting his thoughts settle. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. His path was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so lost. Maybe he didn't need to know all the answers right now. Maybe it was enough to keep moving forward, trusting that the right things would come at the right time. As the final customers trickled out, Tim finished his shift with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was actively shaping his future, one step at a time. And with that realization, he smiled to himself. It felt like a new beginning. The following weeks passed with a natural rhythm. Tim continued to work hard, showing up with a level of commitment that didn't go unnoticed by Mr. Garrison. Lily, too, had begun to recognize the shift in him, often joining him in short conversations about their shared experiences. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And progress, as Tim had learned, was enough. He still had a long way to go, but Keanu's words had planted something in him, a seed that had already begun to sprout. Tim wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to embrace whatever came his way. In the end, that's all anyone could ask for, right? To take the next step with a little more confidence and a little more heart. And so, with each passing day, Tim felt himself growing into the person he was always meant to be, one small but significant step at a time. A few weeks had passed since that pivotal moment with Keanu. Tim had started to feel more grounded in his own life, as if the conversation had truly set something in motion. Each day, he carried himself with more confidence, more purpose. He even started to dream again, not in grand, unattainable terms, but in small, tangible ones. Maybe he could take on a more prominent role in the restaurant, or even eventually start his own business. The idea didn't seem so far-fetched anymore. But Tim's journey wasn't without its hurdles. The restaurant, as always, was a whirlwind of customers, orders, and deadlines. It was easy to lose sight of the personal growth he'd worked so hard to achieve in the face of the chaos. And then there were the moments when his doubts crept back in. Did he deserve the improvements in his work life? Was it all just a fluke? One chilly evening, Tim found himself working the late shift. The usual crowd had left, leaving behind a quiet emptiness in the restaurant. The clink of dishes being washed in the back and the low murmur of conversations between the staff were the only sounds filling the space. He leaned against the bar, catching his breath after cleaning up the dining area. It was then that the door chimed, announcing a new arrival. Tim didn't expect anyone to walk in at this hour, but he quickly straightened up, ready to provide service. When he saw who walked through the door, his stomach dropped. It was Keanu again. This time, though, Keanu wasn't accompanied by friends or other guests. He was alone. As he stepped into the warm light of the restaurant, he looked around, scanning the space with his usual calm, almost meditative presence. Tim froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. Should he approach Keanu? Should he pretend like everything was fine, as though their previous conversations had never happened? He still couldn't fully shake the unease from their first encounter, but now it was mixed with a new sense of familiarity. Keanu had been kind, patient, and understanding. Tim had no idea why he was here, but he couldn't help but feel both nervous and grateful. Keanu spotted him almost immediately. His eyes lit up with recognition, and he walked toward Tim with an easy stride. "Hey, Tim," he greeted, his voice as warm as ever. "Keanu," Tim said, trying to keep his composure, though he could feel his nerves getting the best of him. It's good to see you again." Keanu nodded. "I wasn't sure if you were working tonight, but I thought I'd come by. I've been meaning to have another chat with you." Tim blinked, surprised. "A chat? About what?" Keanu's smile was soft, understanding. "I've noticed some things, good things. You've been different lately. It's clear you're finding your footing, but I thought maybe I could offer some more advice. You've got a lot of potential, Tim. I'd like to help you realize it." Tim was taken aback. Keanu, the owner of the restaurant, someone with an entire empire, was taking time to speak with him. A waiter who had almost messed everything up? It was humbling in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "That means a lot, Keanu," Tim said, feeling suddenly shy, as though the weight of the offer was sinking in. "I'm not sure I deserve it, honestly. I'm still figuring things out." Keanu waved his hand dismissively. "Don't sell yourself short. You're already doing better than you think." Tim felt his heart race slightly, a mixture of nerves and gratitude bubbling up. "What do you mean? I'm just a waiter. I serve food. I clean up. It's not exactly the most glamorous job." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering Tim's words. "It's not about the job itself, Tim. It's about what you bring to it. You're learning how to be present, how to engage with others, how to treat your work with respect. That's the first step in being good at anything." Tim let those words sink in. He had always thought that a job, any job, was just something you had to get through. The point was to make money, survive, and then get to the next thing. But now, thanks to Keanu, he was starting to see it in a different light. The job wasn't something to endure. It was an opportunity to grow, to improve, and to serve with integrity. Keanu continued, his tone more serious now. "There's always room for growth, Tim, but growth requires patience. You can't rush it, and you can't force it. You have to let it come naturally as you keep pushing yourself every day." Tim nodded, but something still nagged at him. "But what if I mess up? What if I don't get the opportunity I'm waiting for? What if it's too late?" Keanu's expression softened, and he leaned in slightly, as if sharing something deeply personal. "It's never too late. You have the time you need. You just have to trust yourself, and trust that everything will fall into place as long as you keep moving forward." Tim was silent for a moment, absorbing the gravity of Keanu's words. The pressure to succeed had always weighed heavily on him, but now Keanu had given him permission to let go of that pressure, to take the time he needed, and to trust that his efforts would lead somewhere. "You've given me a lot to think about," Tim said quietly, a new sense of clarity creeping in. I think I've been rushing things. Maybe I just need to focus on the next right step instead of trying to see the whole picture at once." Keanu smiled, his eyes full of quiet approval. "Exactly. Focus on the process, not the outcome. Take it day by day. Trust that the rest will follow." For a moment, the two of them stood there, simply letting the conversation settle. Tim felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. He had been so focused on his mistakes, on all the things that could go wrong, that he had overlooked the power of taking small, deliberate steps forward. "I'm really grateful, Keanu. I mean, I never expected this," Tim said, his voice genuine. Keanu nodded. "It's no problem, Tim. I like seeing people reach their potential, and I think you've got a lot of it. Just keep working at it, and don't be afraid to ask for help along the way." With that, Keanu turned to leave, but before he did, he paused, offering one last piece of advice. Remember, Tim, it's not just about what you do. It's about how you do it. Make sure you approach everything with respect. Respect for the job, for the people around you, and most importantly for yourself. Tim watched him walk out, his mind racing. He had always thought that success was all about hustling, working non-stop, and achieving the next goal. But now, with Keanu's advice, Tim realized that it was about much more than that. It was about how you carried yourself through each day, how you treated others, and how you respected the journey itself. And with that realization, Tim knew his path wasn't just about finding success. It was about living with purpose and integrity every single day. The following days were a turning point for Tim. He began applying Keanu's words to every part of his life. He approached his work with renewed focus, treating each task with the same level of respect and care, no matter how small or insignificant it seemed. He took time to engage with the customers, to listen to their needs, and to create an atmosphere of warmth and attentiveness. The shift in his attitude didn't go unnoticed. He found himself forming deeper connections with his coworkers and customers alike. One evening, as he was leaving work, Mr. Garrison pulled him aside. "Tim," he said, his voice measured but with a touch of pride, "I've been watching you. You've stepped up in a way I haven't seen before. Keep this up, and we'll be talking about a promotion soon." Tim's heart swelled with a mix of surprise and pride. It was happening. Little by little, things were starting to fall into place. He wasn't rushing the process, but now, he knew that his progress was the result of his consistent effort and the kindness and advice of someone who had seen something in him before he even knew it was there. And for the first time in a long while, Tim felt truly excited for what was to come. As the weeks passed, Tim's life seemed to settle into a rhythm he hadn't known before. His work at the restaurant was steady, and with each passing shift, he felt more confident in his abilities. He had become someone who wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was fully present, giving his best to every customer, every task, and every interaction. He'd stopped focusing on the bigger picture and started appreciating the small wins. The way he had learned to handle the toughest customers with grace, how he'd grown to communicate more effectively with his coworkers, and even the quiet moments of pride when he noticed his own growth. However, as much as things seemed to be going well, Tim still had his doubts. He was still unsure if he was truly on the right path, still uncertain whether this newfound sense of purpose would eventually lead to something more than just stability. Was this the life he was meant to live? Or was it just a stepping stone to something else? He had seen others rise faster than him, been passed over for opportunities, and wondered if he was just too far behind. There were moments of doubt, moments when he thought maybe he wasn't cut out for more. But each time, Keanu's words would return to him, reminding him to take it one step at a time and trust the process. One day, when the restaurant was unusually quiet during the midday lull, Mr. Garrison approached Tim with a serious expression on his face. He was holding a clipboard in one hand, flipping through some papers as he walked over. "Tim, can I talk to you for a minute?" Mr. Garrison asked, his tone businesslike but not unfriendly. Tim wiped his hands on his apron, wiping away the nervous sweat that had suddenly appeared. He followed Mr. Garrison to the small office at the back of the restaurant. As they entered, Mr. Garrison closed the door behind them, and Tim could feel the weight of the conversation coming. "I've been keeping an eye on your progress," Mr. Garrison began, his gaze steady. "And honestly, I'm impressed. You've grown a lot over the past few months. I can see the effort you're putting in, and it's paying off." Tim felt a rush of relief and pride. "Thanks, Mr. Garrison. I've been trying to really focus on my work, make sure I'm doing everything right." "That's exactly what I've noticed," Mr. Garrison continued, his expression softening. "You're a lot more reliable than you were when you started. You've become someone the team can count on." Tim's chest swelled with pride at the compliment. But then, Mr. Garrison's expression shifted to something more serious. "But," Mr. Garrison said slowly, "there's something we need to talk about. We've had some complaints from customers recently, not about you directly, but about how the restaurant is being run. Some of the staff have been getting a little lax with service, and it's starting to affect the overall experience. We can't afford to let that happen, especially now that we're trying to boost our reputation." Tim's stomach dropped. He had worked so hard to stay on top of his tasks, to be reliable, and to show up with a positive attitude every day. He'd noticed that things had been running more smoothly, so the mention of complaints hit him like a punch to the gut. "I understand, sir, but I haven't seen anything like that," Tim said, feeling defensive, even though he knew it wasn't personal. Mr. Garrison nodded. "I know you've been putting in the work, Tim, but we've had some negative feedback about the atmosphere lately. Customers are noticing it. A few of your colleagues have been a little distracted, not as engaged as they should be. It's affecting the overall vibe of the restaurant." Tim took a deep breath, trying to process the information. He knew that some of his coworkers had been a bit more distracted lately, but he hadn't realized it was causing problems. "I'll talk to the team," Tim said, standing a little straighter. "I'll make sure we pull it together." Mr. Garrison nodded, his face softening again. "I'm not asking you to fix everything on your own, Tim, but I've been impressed with how you've turned things around in your own role. Maybe it's time for you to take on more responsibility. Help lead the team. Help get everyone back on track." Tim was stunned. Lead the team? Was he ready for that? He wasn't sure he was qualified to step into that kind of role. He'd never seen himself as a natural leader, always thinking of himself as just the guy behind the scenes, getting things done quietly. But something inside him stirred. He had been working so hard, and now, it seemed like this was an opportunity to put everything he had learned into practice. Maybe this was the challenge he needed. I can do that," Tim said, his voice growing more confident. "I'll help get everyone back on track." Mr. Garrison gave him a nod of approval. "Good. I knew you had it in you. Just remember, leadership isn't just about giving orders. It's about supporting your team, guiding them, and keeping the energy positive. You've already shown that you know how to do that in your own work. Now it's time to expand that to everyone else." Tim left the office feeling both exhilarated and nervous. He had just been handed an opportunity that could change everything for him. But was he really ready for it? Could he actually lead a team? He couldn't deny the excitement bubbling inside him. It was exactly what he needed to take the next step in his journey. The path ahead was uncertain, but it felt like the right moment to push forward, to grow into something bigger than he had ever imagined. Later that evening, Tim called the team together for a quick meeting during a lull in the dinner rush. His heart raced as he stood before them, ready to speak. "Hey, everyone," Tim began, feeling a bit self-conscious at first, but forcing himself to stay calm. "I know we've been having some issues with the atmosphere here lately. I want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward. I'm not here to point fingers, but we all know that we need to step it up. This place is better than the way it's been feeling lately." He saw a few of his colleagues nodding in agreement, and that gave him the confidence to keep going. "We need to work together and bring the energy back to where it was when we were all excited to be here. I know we've all been feeling some burnout lately, but we're a team. We need to support each other and make sure every customer feels the care and attention that this place deserves." As he spoke, Tim saw the others beginning to engage, their eyes meeting his with a sense of shared purpose. For the first time, he felt like he was speaking as a leader, guiding his team rather than just following orders. "Let's remind ourselves why we're here, and let's get back to what we do best," Tim finished, his voice firm but encouraging. The room fell silent for a moment, but then one of the waiters, Rachel, spoke up. "You're right, Tim. We've got this. We just need to refocus." The rest of the team murmured in agreement, and Tim felt a wave of pride rush over him. It was working. His words were reaching them. As the meeting ended, Tim couldn't help but smile to himself. He had stepped into something new, something unfamiliar, but it felt right. The journey was far from over, but he was finally starting to trust that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. Later that night, as he watched the team working in sync and customers leaving with smiles on their faces, Tim realized something important. Leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about guiding others with humility and patience, giving them the tools they needed to succeed, and learning and growing alongside them. For the first time in a long while, Tim felt like he wasn't just surviving life. He was living it. The days following Tim's first step into leadership were a whirlwind of new challenges, learning opportunities, and moments of self-doubt. The restaurant's energy had improved noticeably, and his colleagues seemed more engaged. Still, The weight of his new responsibilities was beginning to settle heavily on his shoulders. He'd done his best to keep the momentum going, continuing to lead by example, offering support to his team, and addressing small issues before they grew. But with the increased responsibility came a level of pressure Tim hadn't anticipated. There were moments when he felt like he was juggling too many tasks, managing orders, helping resolve conflicts, keeping morale high, and trying to meet the expectations of Mr. Garrison. He felt his confidence slip in the quiet moments when no one was watching. Could he really do this? Could he keep the team together and push them to be better without stepping on any toes? What if he made a mistake? It was in these moments of doubt that Tim thought back to the conversations he'd had with Keanu. The owner's words were always a steadying force in his mind. It's not about rushing. It's about the process. Trust yourself and the journey. But the journey was starting to feel like a steep hill. One busy Thursday evening, Tim found himself in the thick of it. The restaurant was packed, and the energy was high. He had already dealt with a series of issues: an order mix-up, a disgruntled customer, a colleague who was falling behind. But he was managing to keep everything together. Just when he thought things were calming down, disaster struck. A VIP table, the kind of customers that Mr. Garrison had specifically asked for Tim to keep an eye on, had been seated at the back. It wasn't just any regular VIP. They were a celebrity couple who had been at the restaurant before. Their arrival was a big deal, and Mr. Garrison had specifically warned Tim to ensure that everything went perfectly for them. Tim was still trying to make sure the rest of the team was on track when he noticed the VIP table looking irritated. One of the staff had been late to greet them, and the drinks had taken too long to arrive. It was a small mistake, but one that could snowball quickly, especially with high-profile guests like these. Tim moved swiftly to their table, trying to mask the tightness in his chest. "Good evening. I hope everything is to your liking," he said, flashing his best customer service smile. The woman, clearly irritated, glanced up at him. "Well, it could be better. The drinks took way too long to arrive, and it's not like you're busy back there." Her tone was sharp, and Tim could feel the tension rising in his chest. "I apologize for the delay," Tim said, his voice calm, but inside, his heart was pounding. "I'll make sure to check on that immediately." But as he turned to walk away, he heard the man at the table call out, "Hey, we didn't order this. We specifically asked for a different wine. Are you even paying attention back there?" Tim froze. This was the kind of moment he had dreaded. The moment when everything seemed to fall apart in front of someone important. "Sorry, I'll fix that right away," Tim said, trying to keep his composure. But as he walked to the bar to address the issue, he could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. This wasn't just about the wine or the drinks anymore. It was about keeping the reputation of the restaurant intact, making sure the team knew that he was capable of handling pressure. When he returned to the VIP table, everything had gone smoothly. The right wine was brought, the drinks were promptly refilled, and the couple's mood lightened considerably. They even complimented him on his professionalism, but the brief tension still lingered in the air. As Tim moved away from their table, he couldn't help but feel the pressure of their expectations weighing heavily on him. This wasn't the kind of leadership he had anticipated. It wasn't just about managing the team or ensuring things ran smoothly. It was about navigating the constant pressure of keeping the entire operation running without faltering. When the night finally came to a close and Tim was cleaning up the back area, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been tested. He had passed, but barely. He had managed to keep things under control, but it felt like he was walking a tightrope, with everything hanging in the balance. As he wiped down the counter, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see Mr. Garrison standing in the doorway of the kitchen, arms crossed. "Tim," Mr. Garrison said, his voice calm but with a hint of seriousness, "can we talk for a minute?" Tim's stomach sank. He had been waiting for this conversation all night, knowing that the evening hadn't gone without its hitches. He nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sure, Mr. Garrison. I know we had a bit of a rough night." "You handled the situation well with the VIP table," Mr. Garrison said, his tone softer now. "I saw the way you responded, and I was impressed by your ability to keep things under control, even when things started to go off track." Tim's relief was palpable, but Mr. Garrison wasn't finished. "But I also saw you struggling, Tim. I could see the stress on your face." Leadership isn't just about managing the big stuff. It's about handling the pressure, staying calm, and knowing when to ask for help. You can't do it all on your own. Tim looked down, feeling a pang of vulnerability. He had been so focused on not failing that he had forgotten the simple truth. He didn't have to do it alone. "You're right," Tim admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to handle everything myself. I didn't want to let anyone down." Mr. Garrison placed a hand on his shoulder. "Tim, no one expects you to be perfect. You're doing great, but you need to trust your team more. Don't be afraid to delegate. You've got a solid team behind you, and they want to help. Trust them, and you'll see that everything falls into place." Tim's shoulders relaxed slightly as Mr. Garrison spoke. He had been so consumed with proving himself that he had neglected the power of teamwork, the very thing that had gotten him this far. "Thanks," Tim said, meeting Mr. Garrison's eyes. "I'll do better. I won't try to carry everything on my own." Mr. Garrison nodded, his eyes filled with approval. "I know you will. Keep up the good work, Tim. You've got more potential than you realize. Don't let the pressure get to you." The weight of those words lingered as Tim watched Mr. Garrison leave the kitchen. He felt a sense of peace that had eluded him all night. He wasn't alone in this. He had a team, and more importantly, he had the tools to lead them. As the night ended and the last of the staff clocked out, Tim stood alone in the empty restaurant. For the first time in a while, he allowed himself to breathe, to reflect on how far he had come. He still had a long way to go, but he wasn't afraid of the journey anymore. He knew that leadership wasn't about doing everything perfectly. It was about learning, growing, and trusting the people around him. And with that realization, he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The next few days at the restaurant felt like a fresh start for Tim. He was more relaxed, his mindset shifting away from trying to handle everything on his own. He had learned the hard way that leadership wasn't about carrying all the weight. It was about sharing it. And with that newfound wisdom, he was able to delegate more tasks, involve his colleagues in problem-solving, and create a more supportive environment for everyone. But just as things began to feel like they were settling into place, something unexpected happened that threw Tim's balance off once again. It was a busy Friday night, the kind of night when the restaurant was bustling with energy. The chatter of customers filled the air, and waiters moved between tables, expertly balancing orders and drinks. Tim was doing his best to keep things flowing smoothly, overseeing the dining room while ensuring the staff was staying on top of everything. Despite the frenetic pace, he was enjoying himself. He had learned to enjoy these busy shifts instead of letting them overwhelm him. But then, disaster struck. A group of VIP guests, this time a wealthy entrepreneur and his associates, were seated at one of the most coveted tables in the restaurant. Tim knew this was going to be important. Mr. Garrison had specifically asked him to make sure the evening went flawlessly. However, right as he was approaching the table to greet them, one of the newer servers, Michelle, rushed up to him, her face flushed with worry. "Tim, I'm really sorry," Michelle said, her voice shaky, "but there's a problem with the kitchen. One of the orders was wrong, and now they're saying they can't fix it in time." Tim froze. His stomach twisted. If the dish wasn't fixed quickly, it could ruin the entire evening for the VIP guests, and worse, it could lead to a complaint to Mr. Garrison. The stakes had just skyrocketed. "Okay," Tim said, keeping his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. "What's the issue with the order?" Michelle explained that the guest had ordered a specific entree that required a delicate preparation, but the kitchen had accidentally sent out a different dish. The problem was that the correct dish required more time to prepare, and the guests were already growing impatient. Tim's mind raced. He couldn't afford to let this slip through the cracks, not tonight. "All right, don't worry. I'll handle it," Tim said, his voice firm. "Can you keep them occupied for a few minutes? I'll talk to the kitchen and figure out how we can fix this." Michelle nodded, visibly relieved that Tim was taking charge. He quickly made his way toward the kitchen, his heart hammering in his chest. As he stepped inside, the kitchen staff looked up, their faces tense with stress. Tim spotted Chef Leo, the head chef, who was busy overseeing the last few orders. "Chef," Tim said, trying to stay calm, "we've got a situation with the VIP table. They're unhappy because one of their orders is wrong, and the correct dish will take too long to prepare." Can we do something to fix this? Chef Leo wiped his hands on his apron, his brow furrowed in frustration. I don't know if we can. That dish is delicate, and it needs to be cooked to perfection. Rushing it would compromise the quality. Tim thought for a moment. He didn't want to compromise the quality, but he couldn't afford to let the VIPs leave unhappy either. Then, an idea hit him. Is there any way we can quickly prepare a similar dish, something just as impressive, but faster? Tim asked. Chef Leo paused, considering the idea. Maybe we could prepare a modified version of the same entree. It wouldn't be the exact dish they ordered, but it might be close enough. If we do it right, they might not even notice. Tim nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. Let's do that then, and I'll take care of communicating with the guests. Just make sure it looks great. Chef Leo gave a reluctant nod, already turning to the team to implement the plan. Tim could see the tension easing in the kitchen. Everyone seemed to be rallying together to fix the problem. Now, it was time to handle the guests. Tim took a deep breath before walking back into the dining room. He could see the VIP table from across the room, and he immediately noticed the way the guests were looking at the servers, their impatience clear. He approached the table with a calm demeanor, trying to project confidence, though his stomach was still in knots. Good evening, everyone. Tim greeted them with a warm smile. I'm Tim, and I'll be overseeing your meal tonight. I just wanted to check in and make sure everything is going well. The entrepreneur at the head of the table glanced up, his expression neutral but with a slight edge of annoyance. Actually, we're having a bit of an issue with the food. We ordered the name of the dish, and it's not what we received. Tim nodded, his heart racing. I'm so sorry for the mix-up. I've already spoken to the kitchen, and we're preparing a new dish for you right now. It will take just a few minutes, and I assure you, it'll be worth the wait. The guests exchanged glances, and Tim could feel their skepticism. The last thing he wanted was for them to feel like they were being given the runaround. I understand that this is frustrating, and I want to make it right for you, Tim continued. If you'd like, I can bring you an appetizer on the house while you wait. I promise we'll take care of everything. The entrepreneur's expression softened slightly, but he still looked disappointed. All right, we'll wait, but we expect this to be fixed properly. Of course, Tim replied with a reassuring smile. I'll make sure it's exactly as you ordered. As he walked away, Tim let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The hardest part was over. Now, it was just a matter of waiting for the kitchen to deliver. He returned to the kitchen, where Chef Leo and his team were quickly putting together the modified dish. The presentation was impeccable, and Tim felt a flicker of pride. It wasn't exactly what the guests had ordered, but it was close enough to ensure that they wouldn't be disappointed. When the dish was ready, Tim took it out himself, hoping that his calm demeanor would keep the guests from noticing the change. He returned to their table, setting the plate down in front of the entrepreneur. I hope this meets your expectations, Tim said, his voice steady. If there's anything else I can do to make your experience better, please don't hesitate to let me know. The entrepreneur took a bite, his face neutral as he chewed. For what felt like an eternity, Tim stood silently, waiting for some sign of approval, or worse, criticism. Finally, the man set his fork down, looking up at Tim with an approving smile. This is actually quite good, he said, nodding. It's not what we ordered, but it's close enough. Thank you for handling this so well. Tim's heart lifted with relief. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you for your patience. The rest of the meal went without a hitch, and the guests seemed to enjoy themselves, their initial irritation dissipating. By the end of the night, they left with compliments for Tim and the staff, tipping generously and expressing their gratitude for the way the situation had been handled. As the shift came to an end, Tim felt a sense of pride wash over him. It had been a stressful evening, but he had faced the challenge head-on and navigated it with grace. He had learned another important lesson in leadership: the ability to think on his feet, make decisions quickly, and manage crises without losing his composure. When Tim finally clocked out, he made his way to the back to grab his jacket. Just as he was about to leave, Michelle walked up to him. Hey Tim, she said with a smile. I just wanted to say thanks for handling everything tonight. You really kept your cool. Tim smiled back. Thanks, Michelle. It's all about the team. We got through it together. As they both left the restaurant, Tim couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. He had learned that no matter how hard things got, he didn't have to face them alone. With his team by his side, he could handle anything. And as he stepped out into the cool night air, Tim realized that this was only the beginning. It was a week later when Tim's world was once again rocked by an unexpected event. The restaurant had been running smoothly. With his growing confidence in leadership, he felt more in control than ever. The staff was working well together, the kitchen was operating at full efficiency, and even the regulars were praising the quality of service. Everything seemed to be falling into place, and for the first time, Tim felt like he was truly starting to master the job. But, as with any journey, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. It was a quiet afternoon shift, just before the dinner rush began, when the restaurant's door opened with a slight creak. Tim looked up from the POS terminal where he was double-checking orders, expecting a regular guest or perhaps a last-minute reservation. But when he saw who had entered, his heart skipped a beat. Standing in the doorway, with a calm yet imposing presence, was none other than Keanu Reeves. Tim froze. He didn't know whether to approach or pretend that he hadn't seen him. Keanu's visits to the restaurant had been infrequent, and although Tim had grown somewhat accustomed to the odd sight of the world-famous actor dining in his restaurant, he had never expected a surprise visit during a slow afternoon. And most importantly, he was in no way prepared to handle an encounter with him in front of the staff. Keanu caught Tim's eye and gave him a small, welcoming smile. "Hey, Tim. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Tim shook himself out of his trance and quickly regained his composure. "No, of course not, Mr. Reeves. Welcome back. It's great to see you. Would you like to sit at your usual table?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, that sounds perfect." Tim led him to a cozy corner near the window, the same table where Keanu had dined on his previous visits. As Tim moved to pull out the chair for Keanu, he noticed that the staff, some of whom had never met him before, were starting to take notice. It was clear that they were all trying to stay composed. But the energy in the room shifted as the celebrity entered. "I'll just give you a moment to look at the menu," Tim said, his voice calm, though he couldn't ignore the sudden rush of adrenaline that hit his veins. Keanu smiled again, settling into the chair as Tim turned to step away. But then Keanu's voice stopped him. "Actually, Tim," Keanu began, "there's something I wanted to discuss with you, if you have a moment." Tim turned back, surprised. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Keanu's face softened slightly, as though he were about to ask something delicate. "I've been watching you here over the past few weeks, and I wanted to say, I'm impressed. You've stepped up in ways I didn't expect. But I also noticed that you're pushing yourself harder than you need to." Tim blinked, his mind processing Keanu's words. I appreciate that, Mr. Reeves. But honestly, it's just part of the job, right? I'm trying to keep things running smoothly." Keanu gave a small, understanding nod. "I get that, but the thing is, leadership is about more than just keeping everything in order. It's about keeping yourself in balance, too. You can't pour from an empty cup." Tim stood there, not quite sure what to say. It wasn't every day that a world-famous actor, let alone the owner of the restaurant, gave you life advice in such a calm and insightful way. Keanu continued, "I can see that you care deeply about this place, and about the people who work here, but you also need to give yourself permission to take a step back. It's okay not to have everything under control all the time." Tim felt a weight lift off his shoulders, as if a hidden burden he hadn't even realized was finally being acknowledged. He had spent so much time trying to be perfect, to be the kind of leader who could handle every problem on his own, that he'd forgotten to take care of himself. The pressure had been mounting, and it wasn't just the responsibilities of running a restaurant. It was the constant need to prove himself, to show everyone that he could do it. "I've been trying to do everything, and I guess I didn't realize how much it was taking out of me," Tim admitted, his voice quiet. "I guess I thought I had to be perfect." Keanu smiled gently. "None of us are perfect, Tim. It's okay to lean on others, to ask for help, and to step back when you need to. You don't need to carry the world on your shoulders." Tim nodded, feeling a renewed sense of clarity. For the first time in weeks, he felt like someone understood the pressure he was under. It wasn't just about managing a team, it was about managing himself. "Thanks, Mr. Reeves," Tim said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I'll try to remember that. I don't have to do it all alone. Keanu's smile widened. Exactly. And hey, if you ever need anything, whether it's advice or just a quiet chat, I'm here. You've got this, Tim. With that, Keanu turned his attention back to the menu, signaling that their conversation was coming to an end. Tim left the table, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and direction. He couldn't ignore the advice Keanu had given him. It resonated with him more than he cared to admit. The dinner rush began shortly after, and Tim dove into the chaos of the night with a newfound sense of calm. He delegated tasks without hesitation, made decisions quickly, and even took a moment to check in with the staff, asking how they were doing. It wasn't just about the job, it was about the people. And for the first time in a while, Tim was able to balance his responsibilities with the recognition that his own well-being mattered too. When the evening came to a close, Tim stayed behind to help clean up, his thoughts still lingering on his conversation with Keanu. As he wiped down the counter, he realized just how much he had grown in such a short time. He had always known the importance of leadership, but now he understood that leadership was about balance, knowing when to step up and when to lean on others, and most importantly, knowing when to take care of himself. As Tim locked up the restaurant for the night, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The weight of perfectionism had been replaced by the understanding that he didn't need to have all the answers. And as he stepped out into the crisp night air, he couldn't help but feel that he was finally on the right path. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real. And with that realization, Tim felt ready for whatever came next. For the next few days, Tim felt a new sense of clarity. He had found a balance between leadership and self-care, and things were running smoothly at the restaurant. The staff was in high spirits, morale was high, and guests were consistently impressed with the service. It felt like the hard work was finally paying off. But, as is often the case, life can change in an instant. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Tim received a phone call from Mr. Garrison, the restaurant's manager. Tim had been looking forward to a quiet evening after a few busy days, but the call would soon turn his world upside down. "Tim, I need to speak with you about something important," Mr. Garrison said, his tone unusually serious. "There's been an issue with the financials. I don't know all the details yet, but it's not good." Tim's heart sank. Financial problems in a restaurant were a nightmare, especially when they weren't anticipated. He had worked hard to get the place running smoothly, and now it felt like everything might be at risk. "What's going on?" Tim asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're short on funds. There's a discrepancy in the accounting books, and we can't figure out where the money has gone. I need you to come in and look over everything with me," Mr. Garrison said. Tim quickly agreed and rushed to the restaurant. As he walked through the doors, the atmosphere felt different. The usual hum of activity was replaced with a sense of unease. The staff went about their duties with a little less enthusiasm, their faces slightly clouded with worry. Inside Mr. Garrison's office, Tim found him sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers, receipts, and spreadsheets. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by stress, and the weight of the situation was clear. "Tim, take a look at this," Mr. Garrison said, motioning to the papers in front of him. "The numbers don't add up. We've been losing money for weeks, and it's starting to affect our cash flow. I don't know what happened, but we need to figure it out before it's too late." Tim sat down and began to sift through the documents. The restaurant's revenue was down significantly, and the expenses were higher than they should have been. There were also a number of missing invoices and unaccounted for expenses that didn't make sense. The numbers didn't lie. It was clear that something was wrong. "This is bad," Tim muttered, scanning the reports. "But how could this have happened? We've been on top of things. The kitchen's been running smoothly. The staff's been doing their jobs. We haven't changed anything major." Mr. Garrison leaned back in his chair, his face drawn with frustration. "That's what I don't understand. I've been looking over the books for hours, and I can't figure it out either. It's like someone's been siphoning money out of the system slowly, over time. But there's no obvious culprit." Tim felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The idea that someone within the restaurant might be stealing money was unsettling. But he couldn't afford to jump to conclusions without solid evidence. "We need to check the records more carefully," Tim said, his voice steady. "Let's go over everything with a fine-tooth comb. Maybe there's something we missed." The two of them spent the next several hours combing through every invoice, receipt, and bank statement. But despite their best efforts, nothing stood out. Everything seemed normal, except for the consistent, unexplained shortfalls. It was as if someone had been stealing in small increments, covering their tracks carefully. Frustrated and exhausted, Tim sat back in his chair. This doesn't make sense. If someone's stealing, they've been doing it for a while. Mr. Garrison nodded grimly. Exactly. And if we don't figure this out soon, we're going to run into serious trouble. We might even have to consider cutting back on hours, or worse, laying off some of the staff. The thought of having to lay off anyone sent a pang of dread through Tim's chest. The staff had become like a second family to him. He couldn't bear the idea of losing any of them, especially after everything they had been through together. But if the restaurant didn't resolve the financial issues, it might be unavoidable. We need to catch whoever's behind this, Tim said, his mind racing. But we also need to protect the people who've been working hard. We can't punish everyone for what one person might have done. Mr. Garrison agreed. I'll reach out to the accountants and see if they can help us find any red flags. But in the meantime, we have to tighten things up around here. We'll have to be extra careful with all transactions moving forward. Tim left Mr. Garrison's office feeling drained, his mind full of worry. The restaurant had come so far, and now everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. He knew the team depended on him to lead them through this, but the uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on him. That evening, Tim couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the restaurant had been taking advantage of the system. The idea of betrayal gnawed at him, and he couldn't help but think of every staff member he had worked with. But he also knew that jumping to conclusions without evidence would only cause unnecessary tension and distrust. As he worked the dinner shift, Tim kept a watchful eye on everything, on the cash register, the way the waitstaff interacted with customers, the inventory in the kitchen. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, even for a moment. Later that evening, as the dinner rush started to wind down, Tim noticed something unusual. One of the waiters, Ben, had seemed a little off all night. Ben was usually a reliable worker, but tonight he seemed distracted, and there were several discrepancies in his orders. Some of the checks he had entered into the system didn't quite add up, and the tips he reported were unusually high compared to what he had actually earned in tips from customers. Tim's instincts kicked in. He didn't want to believe it, but he had to consider the possibility that Ben might be the one involved in the discrepancies. He had to find out more, but he knew he couldn't do it in front of the others. After the last table left, Tim asked Ben to stick around for a moment. He was calm but firm as he spoke to him. Ben, I need to ask you about something, Tim began. I've noticed a few things tonight that don't quite add up with your orders. The checks you've entered don't match the actual totals, and the tip amounts seem unusually high. Can you explain what's going on? Ben's face turned pale. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if he were searching for a way out. Tim, I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Ben stammered, his voice shaking. It started as small stuff, but I was just trying to cover some personal expenses. I never thought it would get this far. I'm sorry. Tim felt a rush of anger, disappointment, and a deep sense of betrayal. He had trusted Ben, and now he realized that the very person he had believed in was the one causing the financial trouble. We need to talk to Mr. Garrison, Tim said, his voice tight with frustration. This is serious, Ben. Ben hung his head, the weight of his actions finally catching up with him. As Tim led him to Mr. Garrison's office, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything they had worked so hard to build could unravel in an instant. The road ahead was uncertain, and Tim wasn't sure what the consequences would be, but one thing was clear. The path to restoring the restaurant's reputation and trust would be a long and difficult one, and Tim would have to lead the way. The next few hours passed in a blur of tension and regret. Ben had confessed, though he seemed almost too numb to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. Mr. Garrison was furious when he heard the news, but there was also a deep sense of disappointment in his eyes. This was a betrayal, one that had shaken the foundation of everything they had worked to build at the restaurant. We trusted you, Mr. Garrison said, his voice cold, as he sat across from Ben. You were part of this team, and now, because of your choices, we might lose everything. Ben's head hung low. I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to spiral this far. I I just got desperate. Tim watched the exchange, his thoughts spinning. He had never imagined that someone on his team, someone he had considered a friend, would be the one to cause such harm. It felt like a betrayal on a personal level, not just a business one. He had always believed in the power of teamwork and loyalty, and now that trust had been shattered. I didn't want to hurt anyone, Ben continued, his voice barely a whisper. I needed the money. Things have been tough for me, and I thought I could get away with it. But now I see how wrong I was. Mr. Garrison leaned forward, his face stern. The problem isn't just what you did. It's the fact that you let it go on for so long. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, and now we have to figure out how to fix it. Tim took a deep breath and stepped forward. He had to take charge, even though his mind was still reeling. Ben, I'm sorry, but this isn't something we can just sweep under the rug. The numbers we're dealing with are serious, and we have to take responsibility for everything that's happened. Ben nodded, tears welling in his eyes. I know. I understand. Please, I'll do anything to make it right. Tim's heart softened slightly. He could see that Ben was genuinely remorseful, but the damage had been done. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. Right now, the most important thing is making sure this doesn't happen again, Tim said firmly. We'll need to review the financials in more detail, and we may have to take legal action, depending on how much damage has been done. But you need to understand that this is bigger than just you. It affects everyone who works here. And if we don't take the right steps, we could lose everything. Ben nodded again, wiping his eyes. I understand. I'm so sorry. I didn't think about how it would hurt everyone else. I'll accept whatever consequences you decide. After a long silence, Tim turned to Mr. Garrison. We need to inform the rest of the staff, he said. They have a right to know what happened, especially if it affects their jobs. We need to be transparent, but also careful about how we approach it. We can't let this tear the team apart. Mr. Garrison sighed, but he nodded in agreement. You're right. The last thing we want is for this to divide everyone. We'll handle it carefully, but the staff needs to understand the gravity of the situation. The next morning, Tim called a staff meeting. The usual buzz of activity in the restaurant was replaced with an air of anticipation as everyone gathered in the dining area. Tim stood in front of the group, his heart heavy with the weight of the announcement he had to make. I know that many of you have noticed some changes recently, Tim began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. There's something important we need to address. We've been facing some financial issues, and after a thorough investigation, we've discovered that there have been discrepancies in the accounting records. It turns out that one of our own team members has been involved in these issues. A murmur rippled through the group as the staff exchanged confused glances. Tim could see the concern and curiosity written on their faces. Ben, who has worked with us for quite some time, admitted to taking money from the restaurant. Tim continued, his voice tight. I know this is hard to hear, and it's not easy for any of us. But I want you all to know that we are taking immediate steps to resolve this. We're reviewing the financial records carefully, and we'll be taking legal action if necessary. We will also be implementing new protocols to ensure that this never happens again. The room was silent. Tim could feel the weight of every eye on him. It was clear that the staff was processing the news, trying to come to terms with what had just been revealed. I know that this might feel like a betrayal, Tim said, his voice softer now. And it's okay to be upset. We all trusted Ben, and this hurts. But I also want to remind you that we're a team. We've built something special here, and we're going to get through this together. We're going to make this right. One of the servers, Maria, stood up and spoke. I can't believe this. I've known Ben for years, and I never saw this coming. Tim nodded, understanding her shock. I know it's hard to accept, but sometimes things aren't always what they seem. This is a tough situation, but I believe in all of you. We've been through a lot together, and we'll get through this too. There were a few more tense moments of silence, but then the mood began to shift. The staff, though shaken, seemed to rally around each other. One by one, they nodded, offering their support to Tim. They were disappointed, but they understood that the most important thing was to move forward and rebuild trust. After the meeting, Tim sat down with Mr. Garrison to discuss their next steps. The reality of what had just happened weighed heavily on both of them, but they knew that they couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The restaurant's future depended on their ability to handle this crisis with grace and resolve. "We need to make sure the staff feels secure," Mr. Garrison said. "We can't let this erode their trust in the restaurant or in each other." Tim agreed. "We'll have to be transparent with them every step of the way. And we'll need to make sure that the financial systems are tighter than ever. We can't let something like this happen again." The days that followed were filled with long hours of paperwork, meetings with accountants, and conversations with legal counsel. Tim and Mr. Garrison worked tirelessly to ensure that everything was in order, but the weight of the situation continued to hang over them. Through it all, Tim remained determined. He couldn't let the restaurant fall apart. He couldn't let the betrayal define them. It would take time, but he knew that with hard work, transparency, and unity, they would rebuild. And through this ordeal, Tim learned an invaluable lesson about leadership. That sometimes, the hardest challenges were the ones that tested not just your ability to manage, but your character. And in times of adversity, the strength of your team and your ability to stay grounded would be what truly carried you through. But as the challenges continued, Tim also knew this. Sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest beginnings. The next few weeks were critical. Tim knew that the path forward wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that the first step was to restore the trust that had been damaged. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about relationships with his team, the restaurant's loyal customers, and himself. As the weeks passed, the staff slowly began to adjust to the new changes that had been implemented. Ben, though no longer a part of the team, had left behind a wake of discomfort that lingered in the air. Some of the employees had a hard time looking at the situation objectively. Others, like Maria, were struggling to reconcile the person they had known with the person who had betrayed them. But Tim knew that all of them needed time to heal, to forgive, and to move on. One afternoon, as Tim reviewed the new financial records with Mr. Garrison, he felt the weight of the past few weeks still pressing on his shoulders. But there was something different now, a sense of progress. They had tightened security on financial transactions, increased transparency, and implemented new training procedures for staff. The restaurant was on the road to recovery. "I think we're making progress," Mr. Garrison said, scanning the latest reports. "The numbers are starting to look better, and the staff seems more settled. It's not perfect yet, but we're on the right track." Tim nodded, though his thoughts were clouded with uncertainty. "It's getting better, but I can't help but feel like there's more to fix. I don't want us to just survive this. I want us to thrive." Mr. Garrison glanced at Tim, reading the determination in his eyes. "We will. It'll take time, but the hardest part is over." That evening, Tim decided to take a step he had been considering for a while, a gesture to show the staff that he believed in them and appreciated their hard work. He knew the morale of the team had taken a hit, and while there had been progress, it wasn't enough. They needed something more, a sense of unity and purpose. Tim decided to host a staff appreciation night. He sent out personal invitations to everyone on the team, asking them to come in for a special evening. No work, no obligations, just a celebration of the team they had become. When the staff arrived, they were surprised to see the restaurant lit with candles, the dining room transformed into a warm, inviting space. The usual tables were cleared, and in their place were long wooden tables laden with a delicious array of dishes. There was laughter and chatter as everyone took their seats, but for the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt light, almost festive. Tim stood at the front of the room, his voice carrying over the noise as he raised a glass. "I want to thank each and every one of you for sticking with this place through thick and thin. I know these past few weeks have been tough, and we've all had to face some hard truths. But what I want you all to know is this: you're not just employees. You're family. And together, we can make this place stronger than ever." There was a moment of silence before the room erupted into applause. It was the first time since the incident with Ben that the staff seemed to feel like they were truly being seen, appreciated, and valued. After dinner, Tim took a quiet moment to reflect on everything that had happened. It was hard to believe how far the restaurant had come in such a short time. But more than the financial recovery, he felt a deeper sense of pride. The team had come together, had worked through their own pain, and had found a way to rebuild. But Tim wasn't done yet. As the weeks went on, the restaurant's fortunes continued to improve. The customers returned in greater numbers, drawn not just by the food and ambience, but by the renewed energy that filled the space. Tim and Mr. Garrison were diligent in reviewing every part of the operation, making sure that every mistake was addressed, every area of concern was dealt with, and that every employee felt involved in the process of change. By the time the restaurant hit its stride again, Tim had realized that the key to success wasn't just financial. It was in the strength of his relationships, his ability to lead, and his willingness to learn and adapt. There would always be challenges, he knew, but the real test was how he would face them. One afternoon, as Tim was sitting at his desk, reviewing inventory, he was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Maria. "I just wanted to talk to you," she said, standing in the doorway. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I wanted to say thank you." Tim looked up from his papers, a little surprised. "Thank you for what?" "For the appreciation night," Maria said, stepping into the room. "I know it wasn't easy to bring everyone together after what happened, but it meant a lot to all of us. It felt like you really believed in us again, and that made a difference." Tim smiled, feeling a wave of warmth. "I didn't just want to thank you guys. I wanted you to know that I believe in all of you. We've all been through a lot, but we've come out stronger on the other side. I couldn't have done it without you." Maria nodded, her expression softening. "We're lucky to have you as our boss, Tim. You've shown us that even when things go wrong, we can turn it around. That's what leadership is all about." Tim was humbled by her words. "I've learned more than I ever expected these past few weeks, but I can't take all the credit. It's you guys who make this place what it is." As Maria left, Tim felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. They had weathered the storm, and the future was full of promise. He could feel it in the air. The restaurant was finally back on track, but this time, Tim was determined to keep it that way. He wasn't just running a business. He was leading a team, a family, and he would do whatever it took to ensure that they all thrived together. And as he walked into the dining room to greet the evening's guests, he smiled. The laughter and conversation filled the space once more, and he knew they had turned the tide. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, but it was clear now that they were stronger than ever. The restaurant was not just a place to eat. It was a place of resilience, of second chances, and of the power of community. And that, more than anything, was what Tim was most proud of. Just as things were starting to feel stable, a new challenge emerged, one that Tim had never anticipated, but which would test everything he had worked so hard to build. It started with a phone call. Tim was sitting in the restaurant office, going through some new marketing ideas when his phone rang. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, but the number had an official look to it. He answered it with his usual calm demeanor, unaware that this call would change everything. "Good afternoon. Is this Tim Walker?" a deep voice asked from the other end. "Yes, this is Tim," he responded. "How can I help you?" "My name is Lisa Taylor. I'm with the city's health department. I'm afraid we have a situation we need to address with your establishment." Tim's stomach dropped. "What kind of situation?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "There have been multiple complaints regarding unsanitary conditions in your restaurant. We've received reports of foodborne illnesses linked to your establishment. I'll need you to come down for an inspection." Tim felt his blood run cold. The last thing he wanted was a health inspection, especially after everything they had been through. He had been so focused on rebuilding the team and the finances that he hadn't thought about the health protocols as thoroughly as he should have. "Of course," Tim said, his voice tight. "I'll be there immediately." As he hung up the phone, his mind raced. He quickly grabbed his jacket and made his way out of the office, his heart pounding in his chest. The restaurant had been doing so well, and he couldn't bear the thought of another setback, especially one that could affect the reputation they had worked so hard to rebuild. Arriving at the restaurant, Tim rushed inside, where he found Lisa Taylor standing at the front with another inspector. They were both dressed in health department uniforms, their serious expressions adding to the weight of the situation. "Tim Walker?" Lisa asked, extending her hand. Tim shook it firmly. "That's me. What's going on? What have you found?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from betraying the panic he felt rising within him. "We've received complaints from customers, several of whom reported feeling ill after dining here," Lisa said. I'm going to need to conduct a thorough inspection of the premises. I suggest you gather your team and prepare for the process. It might take a few hours. Tim nodded, his mind spinning. He immediately called Mr. Garrison and asked him to gather the staff. There was no time to waste, and this could be disastrous if not handled properly. As Lisa and the inspectors began their walkthrough, Tim stood near the kitchen, anxiously watching their every move. He could feel his heart in his throat, the fear of another crisis looming over him. This wasn't something he could control. It was up to the inspectors to decide whether they had failed in their duty to maintain health standards. After what felt like hours, Lisa finally approached Tim, holding a clipboard in her hands. "Tim, we've completed the inspection," she said, her voice measured. "There are a few concerns I need to address. Most of them are relatively minor, but there are some serious issues we need to fix immediately." Tim's stomach sank. What kind of issues? First, the walk-in fridge wasn't at the proper temperature. Some of the items were improperly stored, Lisa began. Second, there were signs of rodent activity near the storage areas. And third, the sanitation logs for the kitchen haven't been properly maintained in the past few weeks. Tim ran his hand through his hair, trying to process the list. "I understand. We've been working on a lot of different things lately, and I can see how these might have slipped through the cracks. What can we do to fix it?" "We'll need you to address these issues immediately," Lisa said, her tone softening a little. "We'll give you a short window of time, 48 hours, to correct the issues. If they're not resolved by then, we'll have to issue a closure order until you can bring things up to code." Tim's mind raced. A closure order? The restaurant couldn't afford that. It would destroy everything they had worked for. "I'll get on it right away," he promised. "Thank you for giving us the chance to fix it." Lisa nodded. "I'll be back to inspect the progress. I expect you'll take this seriously, Tim. We're not just here to point out problems. We're here to ensure the safety of your customers." As she left, Tim turned to Mr. Garrison, who had been quietly observing from the corner. The two of them exchanged a long look, the weight of the situation settling over them. "We can't afford to mess this up," Tim said, his voice shaking with urgency. "We need to fix every single one of these issues. I don't care how hard we have to work. This restaurant stays open." Mr. Garrison nodded. "I'll make sure the staff stays focused. We'll handle the sanitation issues immediately. You focus on the rest." With the clock ticking down, Tim sprang into action. He called in a pest control team to handle the rodent problem, directed the kitchen staff to inspect and discard any spoiled items in the fridge, and put together a new sanitation plan for the entire team. As the hours passed, Tim felt the familiar weight of responsibility pressing on him. This wasn't just about fixing the restaurant. It was about saving everything they had worked for. The staff rallied together, working late into the night to make the necessary changes. The kitchen was deep cleaned, the fridge was restocked and recalibrated, and every inch of the restaurant was scoured for potential hazards. Tim could see the determination in their eyes. This was not a team that was going to let failure define them. The next morning, Lisa returned to inspect the changes. Tim walked her through the improvements, showing her the pest control reports, the new temperature logs for the fridge, and the updated sanitation records. Lisa examined everything carefully, asking questions and scrutinizing the details. Finally, she looked up from her clipboard. "You've made significant progress, Tim. It's clear that you've taken this seriously. I'm happy to report that the restaurant has passed the inspection." A wave of relief washed over Tim, and he exhaled a breath he didn't even realize he had been holding. They had done it. They had fixed the problems, and they had kept the doors open. "That's a huge relief," Tim said, his voice low with gratitude. "Thank you for working with us." "You've done the right thing," Lisa replied. "Now, just make sure you keep up the good work. Regular maintenance and inspections are crucial. If you do that, you won't have to worry about this happening again." As Lisa and the inspectors left, Tim felt the weight lift from his shoulders. But he knew that this was just one more obstacle in a long line of challenges they would face. The restaurant had been tested time and time again, and each time, it had come out stronger. Tim stood in the dining room, looking at the space that had once felt like a place of failure, but was now a symbol of resilience. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Tim had learned that no matter what came their way, He and his team were ready to face it together. There was no more room for mistakes, but there was plenty of space for growth. And this time, Tim was certain of one thing: they would thrive. The journey wasn't over yet, but Tim Walker was determined to lead his team to greater heights than they had ever imagined. With the health inspection behind them, the restaurant's reputation had taken another hit, but this time, it was a different kind of setback. It wasn't a betrayal within their team or a financial misstep. It was an issue of trust, and that, Tim knew, was far more fragile than anything else. The next few weeks were a delicate balancing act. Tim and Mr. Garrison had to act quickly, but strategically. Word of the inspection had leaked, and while the restaurant had passed, it was clear that some customers were hesitant to return. Tim could feel the change in the air. The once bustling dining room now had more empty seats. The staff, though still loyal and hardworking, also seemed a little more guarded, unsure of how to respond to the lingering doubt in the community. Tim knew that if they wanted to rebuild the trust they'd lost, they had to take a different approach. They couldn't just hope the issues would disappear. They had to show their customers that they had taken responsibility, made real changes, and were committed to offering them a safe, enjoyable dining experience. The first step was a public relations strategy. Tim reached out to local food critics and influencers, inviting them to visit the restaurant for a complimentary meal. He wasn't expecting them to overlook the recent challenges, but he hoped that they would see the effort the restaurant had made to improve. "We need to show the community that we're serious about this," Tim explained to Mr. Garrison. "We need them to see the changes firsthand." "I agree," Mr. Garrison said, adjusting his tie as they stood by the restaurant's entrance. "But we have to be prepared for tough feedback. This won't be a quick fix." The first few reviews came in, and to Tim's relief, they were positive. The critics praised the restaurant's transparency and the quality of the food. They acknowledged the past issues, but focused on the improvements that had been made. Slowly but surely, the word began to spread. One afternoon, as Tim was going through emails and responding to customer inquiries, a familiar face walked into the restaurant: Lisa, the health inspector. She had been to several other restaurants since the inspection, but something about her visit that day felt different. She looked around the restaurant with a critical eye, just as she had done before, but there was a sense of ease to her now. "Tim," she said, as she approached the bar where he was seated, "I've been reading your reviews. I have to say, I'm impressed with the way you've turned things around. You've clearly put in the work." Tim stood up and shook her hand. "Thank you, Lisa. We've worked really hard to make sure everything's up to code, and more importantly, to regain the trust of our customers. It's not easy, but we're determined to do it." "I can see that," she said with a nod. "It's rare for a restaurant to come back from a situation like this, but you've done it, and that's saying something." Tim smiled, feeling a small but significant sense of validation. "It's been a tough road, but I think we're finally getting back on track." Lisa paused for a moment, glancing around the room. "Well, I have to say, it looks great in here. I'm not just talking about the cleanliness. The atmosphere feels different, like you've really rebuilt something." Tim appreciated the compliment. It's been a team effort. Everyone's pitched in, from the kitchen staff to the front of house. And we've all learned from our mistakes. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Mistakes? From where I'm standing, it looks like you've learned how to turn them into successes." Tim chuckled. "That's the plan." Before Lisa left, she took a moment to offer one last piece of advice. "Keep up the good work, Tim. You're on the right path. Just make sure you keep the momentum going. The moment you take your foot off the gas, it could all slip away." Tim nodded, grateful for her support. As Lisa exited the restaurant, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. If someone like her, someone whose job was to find faults, could see the changes, then maybe, just maybe, their hard work was beginning to pay off. That evening, the restaurant was buzzing with energy. It wasn't quite as full as it used to be, but the steady stream of customers was encouraging. And more importantly, the atmosphere was lively again. There was a feeling of hope in the air, something that had been absent for weeks. Tim walked through the dining area, greeting customers, making sure everything was running smoothly. As he passed by a table of regulars who had been coming to the restaurant for years, one of them caught his eye. "Tim," the man said, raising a glass, "we heard about the problems you've had recently. We just wanted to say we're glad to see you're back on track. You've always treated us well, and we've got your back." The words struck Tim deeply. This was exactly the kind of support he needed. It was moments like this that reminded him why he had taken on this challenge in the first place. To create something meaningful, not just for himself, but for the community. "Thank you," Tim said, his voice filled with gratitude. "It means a lot to us." He smiled and continued his rounds, the evening feeling more like a celebration than a regular shift. There were still plenty of challenges ahead, but Tim knew that with hard work, honesty, and a team that believed in each other, they would continue to push forward. But the true turning point came the next day, when a loyal customer sent Tim a message through the restaurant's social media page. It was a simple, heartfelt note. "Just wanted to say how much we appreciate your efforts to improve. We've always loved coming here, and we'll continue to support you. You've got our loyalty for life. Keep up the great work." Tim stared at the message, feeling a lump form in his throat. This was the kind of thing he had hoped for. A sign that the work they had done to rebuild trust was actually reaching the people who mattered most. The customers. It was a reminder that while they had faced setbacks, they were still capable of creating something meaningful. There were always going to be challenges, but the key was how they responded. And with a loyal team, a supportive community, and an unwavering commitment to quality, Tim was confident that they would continue to thrive. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Tim knew one thing for sure. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were finally back on the path to greatness. And this time, they wouldn't stop until they reached the top. After all, in the world of restaurants and business, it wasn't just about the food, it was about the people. And with that understanding, Tim Walker had a clear vision for the future. The restaurant's story wasn't just about overcoming adversity, it was about creating a lasting legacy. One customer at a time. Just as Tim began to feel that the storm was finally behind them, life had a way of throwing another curveball his way. This time, it wasn't the health department or an unexpected scandal, but something far more personal. An unannounced visitor that would shake the very foundation of what he had worked so hard to rebuild. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the restaurant was unusually calm. The lunch rush had passed, and the team had a rare moment to catch their breath. Tim was in his office reviewing the latest customer feedback when he heard the unmistakable sound of the front door chime. A man in a well-tailored suit walked in, exuding an air of authority. His presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Tim, who was accustomed to greeting guests and managing staff with ease, felt a strange knot form in his stomach. There was something about the man that felt different, more intense than the usual customer, yet familiar somehow. The man approached the hostess stand, where Anna greeted him with a smile. She was polite but quickly became flustered when she realized this was no ordinary diner. The man leaned forward and asked in a low voice, "Is Tim Walker here?" Anna hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, he's in his office. Can I tell him who's here?" "I'm sure he'll know when I walk in," the man said with a slight smile. As Anna walked back toward the office, Tim's phone buzzed with a text from her. "A man is here to see you. He says you'll know who he is when you meet him." Tim frowned and stood up, adjusting his blazer. Something about the message seemed off. There was no name, no details, just an odd sense of anticipation. He opened the door to the main dining area just in time to see the man walking toward him. The man's eyes locked onto his as he approached, and Tim's heart skipped a beat. "Tim Walker," the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm, but there was no warmth in it. "I think we need to talk." Tim studied him carefully. He was tall, clean-shaven, and had a sharp, calculated look to him. Someone who was used to getting what he wanted. There was no immediate recognition. "Can I help you?" Tim asked, trying to maintain his composure. The man smiled slightly, but it was more of a smirk than a friendly gesture. "You don't know me, but I know you. My name is Mark Thompson." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. Tim's brow furrowed as the name clicked in his head. Mark Thompson? He had heard of him, though not in a way that immediately inspired confidence. Thompson was a powerful restaurant investor, one of the few people who had the ability to make or break a restaurant's success in the industry. But why was he here, now of all times? "I'm aware of your recent challenges," Thompson continued, taking a seat at one of the empty tables. And I think I can help you out of your current predicament. Tim's stomach tightened. What do you mean? He didn't like the sound of that. It sounded like a proposition that would come with strings attached. I'm in the business of fixing restaurants, Tim, Thompson said, leaning back in his chair with a relaxed but calculating air. I've done it for years. I've been watching your restaurant for a while now. You've got potential, but you're missing something. He paused, waiting for Tim to respond. Tim didn't speak. He had been through too many ups and downs lately, and he wasn't about to rush into anything without understanding what was at stake. His first instinct was to decline whatever offer Thompson had, but he needed to know more. What exactly do you have in mind? Tim asked cautiously. Thompson's eyes gleamed with a mix of amusement and business savvy. I can offer you a financial boost, he said, his voice smooth. I have connections, resources, and a team of experts who specialize in turning struggling restaurants into profitable ventures. In exchange for a small stake in the business, I'll help you modernize your restaurant, revamp the menu, and streamline your operations. You'll have the capital and expertise to get to the next level. Tim was silent for a moment, absorbing his words. A financial boost sounded good in theory, especially after the rough patch they had endured. But Tim wasn't stupid. There was always a catch. And the catch? Tim finally asked. Thompson's smile grew slightly wider. The catch is that I'll need full control over some decisions. You can stay involved in the day-to-day operations, of course, but I'll have the final say when it comes to strategic moves. Think of it as a partnership, but one where I call the shots when it matters most. Tim's mind raced as he processed the offer. It was tempting. No one could deny that. But it also felt like giving up a part of what he had fought so hard to preserve, the independence of his restaurant. The idea of letting someone else take the reins on major decisions made him uneasy. I don't know, Tim said, trailing off as he weighed his options. Thompson leaned forward, his voice taking on a more persuasive tone. You're at a crossroads, Tim. I can tell. The truth is, you're running on fumes right now, hoping to regain your former glory. But without the right support, it's going to be an uphill battle. I can take that burden off your shoulders. Let me help you make the decisions that will turn this place into the success you've always wanted. Tim's gut instinct told him to walk away, but the pragmatist inside him couldn't deny the practicality of Thompson's offer. They needed capital. They needed expertise. But could they truly trust him? Could Tim afford to give up a piece of the business? I need time to think about this, Tim said finally. He wasn't ready to make a decision yet, not without considering the ramifications. Thompson nodded, his smirk returning. Take your time, Tim. But remember, opportunities like this don't come around every day. Let me know when you're ready. As Thompson stood up and headed for the door, Tim watched him go, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Was this the solution they had been waiting for? Or was this just another dangerous gamble? For now, Tim knew one thing. He couldn't rush into any decisions. He had built this restaurant from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let anyone take that away from him, no matter how tempting the offer seemed. As he watched Thompson leave, Tim couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. Whatever happened next, he knew that this was a turning point, one that would define the future of his restaurant. And the stakes had never been higher. The next few days were a blur for Tim. His mind was consumed with thoughts of Mark Thompson's offer. He had spent hours replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every inflection in Thompson's voice. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like a lifeline. But a lifeline often came with a cost, and Tim wasn't sure he was ready to pay the price. That night, after the dinner rush, Tim found himself sitting alone in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline. The restaurant had closed for the evening, and the lights of the surrounding buildings twinkled like stars. The silence in the restaurant was both soothing and unsettling. He could hear the faint hum of the cooling system, the distant sound of traffic, but nothing else. It was the calm before the storm. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the messages from his team, but they were mostly routine. Staff schedules, customer feedback, inventory updates. Nothing about Thompson's proposal. Tim didn't want to burden his team with this decision just yet. This was something he needed to figure out on his own. His thoughts turned to the restaurant itself. Everything it had been and everything it could be. He had invested so much into this place, from sleepless nights spent tinkering with the menu to building relationships with customers. He had grown attached to the idea of running the business his way, but he also knew they had reached a point where they needed something more than just heart and hard work. Tim had always prided himself on doing things the right way, on building a business that was rooted in integrity, passion, and a genuine love for what he did. But he also knew the business world didn't always work that way. Opportunities like Thompson's didn't come often. The chance to gain financial stability, expert guidance, and possibly take the restaurant to the next level was undeniably appealing. But at what cost? Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Tim didn't expect anyone, so he opened it to find Mr. Garrison standing there. His expression was neutral, but Tim could see the concern in his eyes. "You okay, Tim?" Mr. Garrison asked, stepping inside. Tim gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, Pete. We need to talk." Mr. Garrison took a seat and waited for Tim to continue. "I had a visitor today," Tim said slowly. "A man named Mark Thompson. He's a big-time investor in the restaurant business. He offered me a deal." Mr. Garrison's brow furrowed. "I know that name. I've heard of him. He's got a reputation for making restaurants thrive, but he doesn't come cheap. What did he want?" Tim exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "He wants to help us. He wants to invest in the restaurant, provide the capital and expertise we need to turn things around. In exchange, he'd want a stake in the business, and he'd have the final say on major decisions." "Sounds like a deal with the devil," Mr. Garrison said flatly. "You don't let someone like that take control. Once he's in, it's hard to get him out." "I know," Tim replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But we're at a crossroads. We need help, Pete. We've worked so hard to rebuild, but I don't know if we can do it on our own. The bills are piling up, the staff's morale is still shaky, and I'm not sure how much longer we can keep up with the pace. This could be the answer." Mr. Garrison leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest as he thought. "I get it, Tim. I really do. But before you sign anything, you need to think long and hard about what you're giving up. Once you bring him in, you're not just getting money. You're losing control. This restaurant is your baby. It's your vision. Do you want someone else calling the shots?" Tim didn't answer right away. He thought about the countless nights he had spent working to make the restaurant everything he dreamed it could be. He thought about the loyal customers, the staff who had stuck by him, and the feeling of pride he got when he walked into the restaurant every day. He didn't want to lose that. He couldn't. But then again, he couldn't ignore the financial reality of the situation. Thompson's offer could provide a solution to the cash flow issues, the stalled growth, the stress that had weighed so heavily on him and his team. It was a lifeline, yes, but it was one that would come with strings attached. "Maybe I'm just tired, Pete," Tim said finally. "Maybe I'm tired of carrying this all on my own. Maybe I need someone who knows what they're doing. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." Mr. Garrison stared at him for a long moment before speaking. "Tim, no one can do this alone. But you've got to be careful who you let into the fold. I know you want to make this work, but I'm telling you, once you let him in, there's no going back. You'll lose the heart of this place." Tim nodded, feeling the weight of the decision settle on him. "I know, Pete. I really do. But I don't know what else to do." Mr. Garrison placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll support whatever decision you make, Tim. But just remember, there's no shame in asking for help. But don't let anyone steal your dream." Tim let the silence hang in the air as he processed his friend's words. Mr. Garrison had always been the voice of reason, and his perspective was one that Tim deeply respected. But the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. They couldn't keep treading water forever. "I'll think about it," Tim said, finally meeting Mr. Garrison's eyes. "I'll make the decision that's best for the restaurant. But whatever happens, we'll do it together." Mr. Garrison gave a small smile. "That's the spirit, Tim. We're a team." After Pete left, Tim sat in his office alone again, his mind heavy with indecision. He knew that whatever choice he made, it would have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for everyone who depended on this place. The offer from Thompson was tempting, but the idea of losing control, of allowing someone else to dictate the direction of his dream, was terrifying. As the hours ticked by, Tim realized that the answer wasn't going to come from anyone else. It had to come from him. It was his vision, his passion, and his responsibility. He couldn't let fear guide him. He needed to trust his instincts. And in that moment, as the city lights outside began to dim, Tim finally made up his mind. He had worked too hard to get to this point to let anyone take it away. He wasn't going to give up control. Not now, not ever. But he wasn't going to do it alone, either. It was time to find a different solution, one that wouldn't compromise his vision or his integrity. Tim wasn't sure what that solution would be yet, but he was certain of one thing. He would find a way. And this time, it would be on his terms. The next few days were a whirlwind. After making the decision not to accept Mark Thompson's offer, Tim had spent countless hours in meetings with his team, brainstorming ideas and reworking their strategy. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that maintaining control of the restaurant's future was essential. Now, more than ever, he needed to think outside the box. Tim had always prided himself on making decisions with his heart, but he also realized that in this case, he had to balance heart with strategy. The restaurant needed money, and it needed it fast, but they also needed to protect what made the restaurant unique: the passion, the authenticity, and the connection with their customers. He wasn't willing to lose that for a quick fix. As he sat in his office, surrounded by piles of papers, receipts, and business proposals, his phone buzzed with a message from Anna, the hostess. "Got someone here to see you. They say it's important. Are you free?" Tim's first instinct was to ignore the message. He was buried in work, and frankly, he wasn't in the mood to entertain visitors. But something about the urgency in her message caught his attention. "Who is it?" he typed back. "Says their name is Sarah James. She didn't give details. She's been here before." Sarah James. Tim had to think for a moment before the name clicked. She was a local entrepreneur, someone who had opened several successful businesses in the city. She had been a regular at the restaurant for the past few months, always coming in for a quiet meal or a business meeting. Tim had always admired her sharp mind and no-nonsense approach to business. He had met her a few times in passing, but they had never had a chance to really talk. What could she possibly want now? "Let her in," Tim replied, intrigued. Maybe this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. A few minutes later, Anna walked in, followed by Sarah. She was dressed in a smart, tailored jacket and dark jeans, her confident stride matching the intensity in her eyes. Tim stood up from his desk, extending his hand. "Sarah, it's good to see you. What brings you in today?" Tim asked, trying to mask his curiosity with a warm smile. Sarah gave him a firm handshake, her gaze steady and determined. "I know you've been through a lot lately, Tim. I've been following what's going on with your restaurant, and I think I might have a solution for you." Tim raised an eyebrow. "A solution? I'm all ears." Sarah took a seat, crossing her legs and placing her briefcase on the floor beside her. "I've been watching you for a while, Tim. I know you're not the kind of person who would sell out or give up control of your dream easily. But I also know that you need help, and I think I can offer you a way to move forward without compromising your vision." Tim's interest peaked. "Go on." "I don't know if you've considered crowdfunding," she began, "but there's a growing trend of people who want to support local businesses, especially ones with as much potential as yours. What if you didn't have to go the route of big investors like Thompson? What if you could turn to your community for support instead?" Tim felt a spark of hope. It wasn't the first time he'd heard of crowdfunding, but he had always dismissed it as a last resort. He had assumed that it was for small businesses that were barely holding on, not something for a restaurant like his. But Sarah wasn't done yet. "Here's the thing," she continued. "I've helped several businesses like yours launch crowdfunding campaigns. I specialize in connecting entrepreneurs with people who are passionate about what they do. This isn't just about getting donations. It's about building a community of loyal supporters who want to see you succeed. And the best part? You maintain complete control over your business. No giving up ownership, no investors calling the shots. It's all yours." Tim sat back in his chair, digesting her words. This was an entirely new approach, one that didn't involve selling a part of the business, but rather rallying the very people who had supported him from the beginning. He had built his restaurant with the help of the local community, and maybe this was the key to unlocking the next level of success. "I like the sound of that," Tim said slowly, "but I don't know the first thing about crowdfunding. How do we even start? Sarah smiled. That's where I come in. I'll guide you through every step of the process. From setting up the campaign to creating rewards for your backers, I'll help you craft a compelling story that speaks to your customers. You'll have access to the funds you need, and you won't have to give up anything in the process. It's a win-win. Tim could feel his excitement building. This felt like the right path, one that kept him true to his values while providing the financial boost he so desperately needed. It wasn't the easy way out, but it felt like the right one. Okay, Tim said, his voice firm with resolve. Let's do it. Let's build a campaign. Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Great. I've worked with a lot of businesses, but I can tell you're different. You've got the heart and the story. Now it's about sharing that with the world. Tim felt a renewed sense of purpose. The crowdfunding idea wasn't just about money. It was about reconnecting with the community, the people who had always believed in the restaurant, even during the darkest times. After Sarah left, Tim sat alone in his office, reflecting on what had just transpired. The weight on his shoulders, which had been so heavy just days before, suddenly felt a little lighter. There was still work to be done. He would have to prepare a compelling campaign, engage with his loyal customers, and convince the broader community that investing in the restaurant was a smart move. But for the first time in a long while, Tim felt like he was on the right track. The next morning, he called a meeting with his team. They needed to get on board with the idea if it was going to work. He told them about Sarah's proposal, and after some initial hesitation, everyone seemed excited. They saw the potential in it, too. With his team behind him, Tim knew they could make the crowdfunding campaign a success. The restaurant had always been more than just a business to them. It was a community, a gathering place, a symbol of their shared effort and passion. As he walked through the restaurant that evening, greeting customers and listening to their stories, Tim felt a deep sense of gratitude. The journey had been long, and it had tested him in ways he never imagined. But now, with a new direction in mind, he was more determined than ever to ensure that this restaurant and everything it stood for would not only survive but thrive. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a while, Tim didn't feel alone. He had his team, his community, and now, a plan to take them all to the next level. And that was all he needed to move forward. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Tim and his team dove headfirst into planning the crowdfunding campaign. Sarah James had proven to be an invaluable resource, guiding them every step of the way, offering advice, and connecting them with marketing experts and social media influencers who could help spread the word. This was a whole new world for Tim, but Sarah's confidence and knowledge gave him a sense of direction. The first step was crafting their campaign story. It wasn't just about the food or the restaurant itself. It was about the people, the relationships they had built, and the dream that had started with nothing but a small, humble space and a love for cooking. Tim spent countless hours writing and revising the campaign pitch. He wanted it to resonate with their community, to make people feel like they were part of something bigger than just a restaurant. It wasn't just about saving a business. It was about creating a legacy. As they fine-tuned the message, they also worked on rewards for backers. These rewards had to be meaningful, something that would make backers feel truly involved in the restaurant's success. Tim's idea was simple: offer a behind-the-scenes experience. Backers would receive exclusive invites to private tastings, cooking classes with the chefs, and even personalized menus crafted just for them. They wanted supporters to feel like they were part of the restaurant's inner circle. Sarah also suggested a tiered system, where people could donate at different levels in exchange for varying levels of perks. From a simple thank you card for small contributions to a VIP experience for those willing to invest more, they tailored the rewards to match every budget. While Tim focused on the creative side, his team worked diligently on the technical aspects. They set up the campaign platform, developed a social media strategy, and planned outreach to local media outlets. It was all hands on deck, with every member of the team pitching in to make sure the campaign was a success. By the time the campaign went live, Tim could feel the weight of anticipation in the air. They had worked so hard, but now the future of the restaurant was in the hands of their community. As he stared at the campaign page for the first time, the reality of what they were trying to achieve hit him. They were asking people to believe in them, and as he looked over at his team, he saw the same mix of nervousness and hope in their eyes. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust. The people they were reaching out to were their friends, their regulars, their neighbors. These weren't just anonymous backers on the internet. These were people who had supported the restaurant from the beginning. The first day of the campaign was a nerve-wracking blur. Tim and his team worked around the clock, posting on social media, responding to messages, and reaching out to local influencers. They made videos, shared behind-the-scenes footage, and told their story with as much passion as they could muster. Slowly but surely, the pledges started coming in. It wasn't a flood at first, just a steady trickle. A few $100s here, a few thousand there. But the important thing was that people were responding. They were believing in the dream. By the end of the first week, they had raised nearly 25% of their goal. It wasn't an overwhelming success, but it was promising. Tim was cautiously optimistic, but he knew this was only the beginning. They needed more attention, more people to see what they were doing. That's when things started to pick up. Sarah's network of influencers had kicked into high gear. A local food blogger who had a large following shared the campaign on her Instagram. A popular podcast about local businesses invited Tim to come on and talk about his journey. And a well-known chef in the area offered to host a live-streamed cooking demonstration to raise money for the campaign. The momentum was building, and it was starting to feel real. But with the excitement came pressure. Tim was spending every waking moment focused on the campaign. He found himself waking up in the middle of the night, checking the pledge numbers, responding to messages from backers, and brainstorming new ways to engage with the community. The days were long, and the stress was mounting. But the more people believed in the campaign, the more energized Tim became. This wasn't just a way to save the restaurant. It was a movement, and he was at the center of it. A few weeks into the campaign, they hit their first major milestone. 50% of their goal had been reached. Tim couldn't believe it. They were halfway there. But just as things were looking up, they hit a snag. The restaurant had to deal with a sudden health inspection that uncovered a few minor issues. Nothing that couldn't be fixed quickly, but it was still a setback. Tim was exhausted and worried about the potential impact on the campaign. He didn't want anything to derail their progress. He called a team meeting to address the issue. "We can fix this," Tim said, his voice firm. "It's just a few minor things, but it's going to take all hands on deck. We need to make sure everything is perfect." His team rallied around him, determined to get everything sorted out without it affecting the momentum they had built. They worked late into the night, cleaning, repairing, and making sure every detail was up to code. They also made sure to communicate with their backers, updating them on the situation and assuring them that the restaurant was still moving forward. The next day, after a final inspection, the health department gave them the green light. It was a small victory, but it felt like a huge relief. With the issues at the restaurant resolved, Tim and his team refocused on the campaign. They pushed harder than ever, reaching out to even more local businesses, sharing new updates, and celebrating the milestones. By the end of the second month, they had exceeded their initial goal by 30%. The campaign had been a success, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about the people who had come together to support them. Local businesses had donated, regular customers had pledged their support, and new faces were showing up every day, excited to be a part of the restaurant's future. Tim's heart swelled with gratitude as he read through the messages from backers. People were so invested in the restaurant, so eager to see it thrive. Some had donated because they loved the food, others because they believed in what Tim was doing. But all of them had one thing in common: they cared. The community had spoken, and Tim knew now, more than ever, that the restaurant was in good hands, not just his, but the hands of everyone who had supported them. The dream was alive. The path was clear. Tim wasn't just building a business. He was building something much bigger than himself. A place where people gathered, supported each other, and shared in the joy of good food and good company. And this was only the beginning. The success of the crowdfunding campaign marked a turning point for Tim and the restaurant. What had started as a small, uncertain hope now felt like a tangible reality. With the funds raised, they were able to make the necessary upgrades to the restaurant, both in terms of decor and infrastructure. But beyond the money, there was something even more powerful at play: the community's support. It was incredible to watch how the campaign had rippled through the city. What started as an effort to save the business had become a story of resilience, collaboration, and belief in something bigger than just a restaurant. The backers, who were now more than just customers, felt a sense of ownership and pride in the success of the restaurant. They had invested in Tim's vision, and that investment went beyond dollars. It was personal. Tim's phone buzzed as he stood behind the bar one afternoon, preparing for the dinner rush. He glanced down to see a message from Sarah. "Tim, I've been talking to a few people. There's a local event coming up next month that might be a great opportunity for the restaurant to get more exposure. It's a food festival. They're looking for vendors and unique experiences. What do you think?" Tim didn't hesitate. The restaurant had been getting more attention, but now was the time to capitalize on that momentum. He knew that exposing their restaurant to a wider audience could lead to even more success. "That sounds like exactly what we need," Tim responded. "Let's do it. I'll start preparing. Thanks for the heads up." The food festival was a major opportunity for exposure. It was a chance to showcase their culinary offerings to a crowd that might not have otherwise discovered them. But it was also a chance to thank the community for their incredible support. Tim's vision was clear. They wouldn't just participate in the festival, they would make a statement. He gathered his team to discuss their plan. "This festival is our moment," Tim said, standing in front of the group. "We've got something unique here. People don't just come for the food. They come for the experience, for the connection. And that's what we need to show everyone. This is bigger than us. This is about the community." There was a buzz of excitement among the staff. They had come a long way, and now they had the opportunity to showcase their hard work in front of a broader audience. The planning was intense. The team brainstormed menu options for the event, deciding on a few crowd-pleasing dishes that showcased their most popular offerings, as well as a couple of special creations that reflected their innovative approach. Tim wanted to push boundaries, not just in terms of the food, but also in how they presented themselves to the public. "We're not just going to be another booth at the festival," Tim told his team. "We're going to create an experience. We're going to make people remember us long after they leave." In the weeks leading up to the event, the team worked tirelessly to get ready. They tested recipes, perfected their presentations, and created an immersive experience that made their booth feel like an extension of the restaurant itself. They brought in unique decorations and created a small area for customers to interact with the chefs as they prepared the dishes. Tim even arranged for some of their regular customers to be there, acting as ambassadors to share their personal stories of how the restaurant had impacted them. On the day of the festival, Tim could feel the excitement in the air. The streets were lined with food vendors, musicians, and artists, each trying to capture the attention of the crowds. Tim and his team set up their booth early, and as the event began, it was clear that the restaurant was making an impact. People stopped by, curious about the atmosphere they had created. They were drawn in by the unique presentation, the lively energy of the staff, and of course, the delicious aromas wafting from the booth. Tim watched as people enjoyed their food, shared laughs, and took photos. He felt a deep sense of pride in what they had built. This wasn't just about serving food. It was about creating memories, about making people feel something special. By the end of the festival, Tim was exhausted but exhilarated. The feedback they had received was overwhelmingly positive. People were taking to social media, sharing photos of their meals and tagging the restaurant. Some even came up to Tim personally to thank him for the experience, telling him how much they appreciated the care and love that had gone into everything. It was a breakthrough moment. Tim knew that the festival had cemented the restaurant's place in the local food scene. But what was even more heartening was the number of people who approached him about investing in the business, not financially, but through partnerships and collaborations. One of the festival organizers, a well-known figure in the local culinary scene, approached Tim with an idea. "Your restaurant has something special. We want to feature you in an upcoming series about local culinary stars. You've got a story people need to hear." Tim was speechless for a moment. The recognition was beyond anything he had expected. This wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about thriving, about turning the restaurant into a symbol of resilience, community, and innovation. As the weeks went on, the ripple effect continued. The restaurant's social media following grew exponentially. New customers started coming in, some curious about the crowdfunding campaign, others drawn in by the buzz around the festival. Local businesses reached out to Tim with offers to collaborate on events, and the media took a stronger interest in the restaurant story. Tim and his team worked hard to maintain the momentum. They kept engaging with their new customers, thanking them for their support and telling them about the restaurant's journey. It was clear that the community was fully invested in their success. Tim made sure to never lose sight of what had gotten them this far. The people who had believed in him, in the restaurant, and in the idea that great food could bring people together. But as the restaurant grew in popularity, Tim began to realize something deeper about his role. He wasn't just a restaurateur anymore. He was a storyteller. Every dish, every event, every interaction was a chance to share the story of the restaurant and the community that had helped build it. He thought back to the days when it had seemed like everything was falling apart. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now, looking at the bustling restaurant and hearing the laughter of customers, Tim knew that all the struggles, all the sacrifices, had been worth it. But he also knew this was just the beginning. The restaurant had come a long way, but there was still so much more to achieve. They had built a solid foundation, but now it was time to grow, to expand, to continue to inspire and connect with people in ways they hadn't yet imagined. And as Tim stood in the middle of the restaurant, watching the team work together with smiles on their faces and passion in their hearts, he realized that the dream was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had helped make it a reality. The ripple effect had begun, and it was only growing stronger. This was just the beginning of something extraordinary. As the restaurant's popularity continued to grow, so did the challenges. Tim had always known that success came with its own set of obstacles, but he had no idea how complex things could become once the restaurant's name was on everyone's lips. With the success of the crowdfunding campaign and the festival behind them, they were now facing the pressures that came with managing a business that was rapidly expanding its reach. At first, it felt like an exciting whirlwind: new customers, new collaborations, and an ever-growing fan base. But with it came a constant demand for Tim's attention. There were more press interviews to conduct, more events to attend, more decisions to be made, and more people depending on him to keep things running smoothly. The excitement of growth quickly gave way to a grueling schedule that left little time for rest. Despite the overwhelming work, Tim remained determined to maintain the restaurant's integrity. He didn't want to fall into the trap of compromising on quality for the sake of profit. But as orders surged, the pressure to keep up with demand increased, and Tim realized just how much harder it was to maintain the level of service and quality that had made the restaurant so special. One evening, during a particularly hectic dinner rush, things started to go wrong. The kitchen was behind on orders, some dishes weren't up to the usual standards, and a few customers were becoming frustrated with the long wait times. Tim could feel the tension mounting in the air, and his heart raced as he darted between the kitchen and the dining room, trying to calm down upset guests and coordinate with his staff. After what felt like hours of chaos, Tim took a deep breath and stepped into the back office for a moment of respite. His phone buzzed with messages from Anna and Sarah, both of whom had checked in to see how things were going. He couldn't keep up with all the demands anymore, and he was starting to feel the weight of the responsibilities bearing down on him. The restaurant's success had brought with it an even greater need for careful management. Tim needed to scale up. He needed better systems, more staff, and most importantly, more time. The pressure was beginning to affect him personally, and he realized that if he didn't find a way to balance his life, things could spiral out of control. After the dinner rush had subsided, Tim called a meeting with his key team members. They needed to address the growing pains and figure out how to manage this newfound success without losing the essence of what made the restaurant special. "All right, team," Tim began, standing before the group in the staff lounge. "I know things have been getting crazy lately, and I'm feeling it too. We've grown, and with growth comes new challenges. The thing is, we can't let the stress of it all affect what we're trying to do here. We need to get smarter about how we operate." He could see the exhaustion in his team's faces, too. Everyone was working long hours, juggling multiple roles, and doing their best to keep the restaurant running smoothly. They were all invested in the success of the business, but they were also starting to feel stretched thin. "I think it's time for us to take a step back and reevaluate," Tim continued. "We need to bring in some more support. We can't keep doing this with the same number of staff and expect the quality to stay the same. I'm talking about investing in new kitchen equipment, maybe bringing in a manager to help with operations, and streamlining some of our processes. We've got a lot of new customers, but we need to make sure we're prepared for the growth." The team nodded in agreement, and Tim could feel a sense of relief in the room. They all understood the need for change, and they were willing to work together to make it happen. But it would take time, effort, and careful planning to implement the necessary changes. In the weeks that followed, Tim worked closely with his team to bring in the right resources. They upgraded the kitchen with more efficient equipment, hired additional servers, and brought in a restaurant operations manager to help with the logistics. With Sarah's help, Tim also implemented new systems for inventory and staff scheduling, which helped reduce the chaos during busy periods. The improvements weren't immediate, but slowly, things started to settle down. The staff had more breathing room, the quality of the food and service remained high, and customers were still coming in droves. Tim had learned the hard way that scaling up wasn't just about adding more staff. It was about finding balance and ensuring that the growth didn't compromise the values that made the restaurant unique. One evening, as Tim was walking through the restaurant after another successful dinner rush, he took a moment to observe everything that had been accomplished. The atmosphere was buzzing with energy, and people were enjoying themselves, laughing, talking, and savoring the food. It was exactly what he had dreamed of when he first started the restaurant. But now, it was more than just a dream. It was a thriving, living thing. A community-centered restaurant that had come to mean something special to so many people. Tim smiled to himself as he made his way to the back office. He knew there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while, he felt a sense of accomplishment. They had made it through the toughest times, and now they were building something sustainable. As he sat down in his office, Tim reflected on the journey that had brought him here. There had been so many times when it had felt like the odds were stacked against him. But with the help of his dedicated team, the support of the community, and the lessons he had learned along the way, Tim had found a way to turn things around. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "You're doing it, Tim. Look at how far you've come. The restaurant's story is inspiring so many people, including me. Keep going." Tim smiled and typed a quick reply. "Thanks for believing in me. We couldn't have done it without you." As he hit send, Tim realized something important. The success of the restaurant wasn't just about the food or the profits. It was about the people, his team, his customers, and everyone who had supported the restaurant along the way. It was about creating something that would stand the test of time, something that would continue to inspire and connect people for years to come. And as Tim looked out at the bustling dining room, he knew that this was just the beginning of an incredible journey. The challenges were far from over, but he was ready. The restaurant had proven that with hard work, perseverance, and a little help from those who believed in you, anything was possible. The future was bright, and Tim couldn't wait to see where it would take them. The months following their successful crowdfunding campaign and the challenges they had overcome were nothing short of transformative. Tim's restaurant had become a beloved staple in the local food scene. But more than that, it had become a symbol of perseverance, community, and passion. The journey had not been easy, but every hurdle they had overcome only solidified their commitment to making the restaurant something special, something lasting. Tim knew the restaurant had come a long way from the days of uncertainty. He remembered the struggles they'd faced, the doubts that had crept in, and the overwhelming feeling of being on the edge of losing it all. Now, they were thriving. The crowds were larger, the staff was stronger, and the menu, once just a reflection of Tim's love for cooking, had evolved into a unique and carefully curated experience that had won over even the most discerning food critics. But despite the success, Tim had learned something valuable along the way. Success wasn't just about expanding or scaling the business. It was about holding on to what made it special in the first place. It was about creating a place where people didn't just come to eat, but where they came to belong. One evening, as Tim sat down with Sarah and Anna to discuss the future of the restaurant, he realized that they were at a crossroads. The business had grown, and the team had successfully navigated the challenges of scaling up. Now, it was time to think bigger. It was time to build a legacy, not just for the restaurant, but for the community that had supported them from day one. "I've been thinking a lot about where we go from here," Tim said, looking at his two closest allies. "We've done well, but what if we could do more? What if we could create a chain of restaurants, each one reflecting the values we've built here? A place where people could come together, not just for great food, but for something deeper, something that truly connects them?" Sarah raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You're thinking about expansion? Tim nodded. But not just any expansion. I want to open a few new locations, but I want them to feel just like this place. I want to create an experience that's consistent, something that makes people feel like they're part of something bigger, something that's community-driven and authentic. We've learned so much over the past year, and I think we're in a position to make it happen. Anna, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. It's a big leap, Tim, but if there's anyone who can make it work, it's you. The key will be to stay true to the values that made this restaurant what it is, the sense of connection, the focus on quality, and that genuine care for every customer. Tim leaned back in his chair, thinking about everything they had accomplished. The restaurant wasn't just a business. It was a community, a place where people gathered, formed friendships, and shared in the joy of good food. And that sense of community, Tim realized, was the foundation on which they had built everything. It wasn't just about what they served. It was about how they made people feel. It's all about the people, Tim said, his voice firm with conviction. If we stay focused on the relationships we've built, the rest will follow. We need to make sure every new restaurant has that same energy, that same feeling of belonging. The team spent the next few weeks mapping out a plan for expansion. They would start small, opening just 2 new locations in nearby cities, each one carefully chosen for its vibrant community and food culture. The goal wasn't to become a chain. It was to build more places where people could experience what they had created together in their first restaurant. As the expansion plan began to take shape, Tim couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. The restaurant, once a dream on the verge of collapse, was now a beacon of hope for others who had faced challenges and setbacks. They were proof that with hard work, perseverance, and a little help from others, anything was possible. Soon after, the first new location opened. Tim, Anna, Sarah, and the team made the journey to oversee the opening. They had worked tirelessly to replicate the atmosphere and quality of the original restaurant, and they were eager to see how the new location would be received. On the opening night, the restaurant was packed. People had come from all over, excited to be a part of the new experience. As Tim stood at the front, greeting guests, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The night went off without a hitch. The food was perfect, the service impeccable, and the energy in the room was exactly what Tim had hoped for. It felt like home. The people who walked through the door didn't just see a restaurant. They saw a place where they could connect with others, share a meal, and become part of something special. As the evening drew to a close, Tim found a quiet moment to step outside and take in the scene. The lights of the new restaurant gleamed in the night, and he watched as people walked away, smiling and laughing, sharing stories about their experience. He knew they had done something truly meaningful here. And with that knowledge, Tim realized that the legacy they were building wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about the way they had touched people's lives. Back at the original location, the restaurant had continued to thrive. The staff was stronger than ever, and the customers who had been with them from the beginning were more loyal than ever. But now, as Tim looked toward the future, he realized that the true measure of success wasn't the number of locations they had or the profits they made. It was the impact they had on the lives of others. In the years that followed, the restaurant grew into a small but respected chain, with locations in multiple cities. Each one felt like a family, an extension of the original dream. And as Tim looked back on everything they had accomplished, he couldn't help but feel grateful. The journey had been difficult, but it had been worth every step. The restaurant had become a symbol of community, of resilience, and of the power of human connection. And as long as people continued to walk through their doors, eager to share in the experience, Tim knew their legacy would live on. It wasn't just about building a business. It was about creating a place where people could come together, share a meal, and remember that the simple things in life, like good food and great company, are often the most important. And as Tim watched his team continue to thrive and grow, he knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.